really had fantastic ideas about the speakers to invite, and also to thank Alessandro for inviting us to do this together. Basically, what we're hoping to do today is to invite our speakers, all of whom are experts in the field, to really reflect on the state of trafficking and anti-trafficking, with a view to imagining alternatives. And so for that reason, we've organised the day's event into these 3 separate panels. We start with institutional responses. We then have a panel on lived experiences, and then the final panel is about looking forward, so a futures panel. Unfortunately, because of the time difference and the fact that being online allows us to invite people from around the world, it does mean that we will lose some people throughout the day. So Marie, for instance, and Siru, who are starting us off, will have to go to bed because it's late. It's late where they are. The way the event will work is, by now we should be familiar with this, although we were all talking before about how we're not so familiar with the Teams platform, is that we will ask all of the participants to stay muted and to keep their cameras off while the speakers are speaking. And I think it might be nice for the speakers if the rest of their panel and the chair could have their videos on, so they're not just speaking into the void. And we'll go through the speakers one at a time. So the chair will introduce each speaker, and then the speaker will present, and then the chair will introduce the next speaker, and then that speaker will present. And once all of the speakers on the panel have spoken, then we will have time for a discussion. So at least on the version of Teams that I have on my screen, there is not a chat function. I'm not sure if that's the same with everybody's. So I think what we'll have to do when we come to the discussion is, if you could use the little raise hand function, then the chair, will call on you to ask your question. And at that stage, if you can, if there's no reason not to, it would be good if you turned on your video to ask the question. So please do write down some questions as we're going along, because the 2 of the 3 panels have got 4 speakers. And unfortunately, the second panel today, we have learned this morning that one of our speakers, Vandana Patanayak, is unable to attend because she got the AstraZeneca jab. And those of us who've had the AstraZeneca jab know that you feel pretty rubbish for about 24 hours afterwards. So she's not feeling too well. But otherwise, all the other panels, as far as we know, everybody's coming, and the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes each, except on the second panel where they can now speak for 20 minutes. And then we should have about half an hour for discussion. We also have a little break between the second and third panel so that we can go have lunch, and then come back for the final panel to think about futures. So thank you very much for logging on, and I'm really looking forward to learning a lot today. And Alessandro, I will now hand over to you as the joint host of the event and also the chair of the first session.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you everybody for being here, and to our speakers for having accepted our invitation. I will just take 2-3 minutes, not more, for before giving the floor to our speakers to say a few words to briefly explain how this event is part of the activities of the Center of Excellence, EUMoSIT. Center of Excellence, as Mary said before, is based in Palermo, is directed by Vincenzo Militello. I don't know if he's with us today, but he should be in a couple of minutes. And is a 3-year project which is focused on Europe between mobility and security, the challenges of illicit trades in the Mediterranean area. The project is carried out thanks, among, of course, other things, to the help and cooperation of such partner institutions as Border Criminologies, of course, but also the University of Barcelona, as well as to the contribution of several colleagues around Europe, including UK, of course, but also Spain and Portugal. The center started its activities in November 2019. During the first year, we took on the topic of trafficking and cultural heritage. This is our second year of activity, during which we have dealt with illegal traffics having persons as objects, so trafficking in human beings and smuggling of migrants. And well, today's workshop comes at the end of our 3 months of seminars concerning these topics specifically. And as has been said by Mary, it will be specifically focused on anti-trafficking policies. But I have, in fact, nothing else to say. So if Mary agrees, I would directly start with the first panel. Mary, it's okay if we start? Okay. Just by presenting our speakers. The first panel, panel 1, is devoted to institutional responses, which basically means how institutions, national, but to some extent international institutions deal with human trafficking and at least in part human migrant smuggling. And in particular, as we will see, the panel is focused on the way in which these responses impinge or at least impact on the situation of persons who are victims of human trafficking. Our first speaker is Marika Segrave, who is Associate Professor of Criminology at Monash University, Australia, and a Deputy Director of the Monash Migration and Inclusion Center, where she also leads the Trafficking and Slavery Research Group and works with the Border Crossing Observatory. She has written a lot on human trafficking and slavery-like practices, including a book on sex trafficking and modern slavery. And today she will lecture on the elusive question of impact. Mary, the floor is all yours. Thank you. It would be great if you could turn your on. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin, because I'm in Melbourne, Australia, by acknowledging the land that I'm on, the land of the Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land, and acknowledge any elders, past, present, emerging, who are with us, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It's wonderful to begin this important conversation, and I really want to speak broadly. Where I am speaking from is over 15 years, I think it's getting closer to 20 years of doing research around responses to trafficking and exploitation. And I will focus a lot on the Australian context, but the Australian context is not particularly different to other contexts, but my work has spanned across Australia and ASEAN in particular. But what I want to talk about is one of the consistent criticisms around trafficking and the response to trafficking since its first inception 20 years ago, when the Palermo Protocol came about, so its modern contemporary recognition, has been the utilisation of the criminal justice system. And it has long been a criticism that the criminal justice system is limited and fails to understand and think about trafficking. And in some respects, it seems like this is a tired criticism. Why do we keep coming back to this? But it's absolutely essential for us, as we take stock now, to think about 20 years since the Palermo Protocol and the move away from trafficking and the specificity of nations' focus on trafficking to the abandonment of that specificity towards the much more elusive focus on modern slavery. And what is happening in that context is an already limited framework for responding and understanding and comprehending exploitation and how we should respond, becoming even more elusive. All forms of exploitation now sit under the umbrella of modern slavery, and we see the emergence of grand plans to end and eradicate modern slavery, which sounds wonderful. It is utterly compelling. But when I speak to businesses who are now at the forefront of making these commitments, when I ask them who is a victim of modern slavery, what do you imagine? Who's going to walk through the door as a victim of modern slavery? They all are thinking about most often one particular kind of thing, someone who is very different to them, most often someone who in the Australian context is not Australian, and who they understand to have come to that circumstance because of their own circumstances, that are conditions that sit within another country, that are connected to poverty, and that are connected to broader issues that are beyond our control. And we can do some things to try to help that. But broadly speaking, the view has remained, I would say, consistently narrow and concerningly unable to deal with the complexity of people's experiences, but also to attend carefully to what have we achieved in 20 years. So I would like to turn to Australia, because Australia has just developed its next 5-year National Action Plan, which has totally removed trafficking now from that National Action Plan. Its third or fourth iteration, trafficking has always been at the forefront. It's now a modern slavery action plan. Trafficking is in there, but what's new about that? At what point in that response is there any recognition of what we have done to date and the success of that? So nearly 10 years ago, my colleague, Sanja Milivojevic, and I wrote about Australia's response to trafficking, where the first policy response was implemented. There was perhaps one prosecution, and that was heralded as a success. Let's build on that success. We still have a model 20 years down the track that is basically the same. We have one kind of victim response, which you can only access through the criminal justice system. And we have a criminal justice prosecution focus. And now we have included within that the recognition that businesses have a role. There's no consideration when we look at the new plan for the untested and the unsubstantiated reliance on the criminal justice system as deterrence. In nearly over 10 years, nearly 15 years in Australia, we have had 20 convictions under our trafficking and slavery-like practices, the legislation in place. 20 convictions over 15 years. We've had many hundreds of people go through the victim support package, but it's estimated that at any one time there are at least 1,000 in the production of global guesstimates. At any one time, this many people. So over 1,000 at any one time in Australia experiencing some form of modern slavery. So it's absolutely critical and also very difficult to keep having this conversation. There is no willingness to accept that the criminal justice model has substantive problems. We need to carefully think about how that's working, and where we need to begin is what we think the criminal justice system is doing. One of the big problems we have in Australia is that modern slavery includes forced marriage. Victims of forced marriage who come to the attention of the AFP, the only model that exists for recognition of forced marriage in Australia and the only national legislation that includes forced marriage, often don't want to engage with police and are looking for someone to support them, not to prosecute or criminalise their family members. The response to trafficking isn't built on and based upon an understanding of familial and gendered violence. It doesn't deal with the familial consequences of going to the police. So there are significant harms produced by having a criminal justice system as the only way we respond. It's absolutely essential when we think about impact, we don't just consider the performance measures of the criminal justice system, but what is the impact of this being the only way we respond? If you can't access this, or if it's not useful for you, we have no other model. One thing to note in the context of that is that in Australia last year, a woman was killed by an abusive partner. She had been in touch with the AFP in relation to forced marriage before she married him. Charges were laid after she died and she had married him. What are we thinking is working in relation to that response to forced marriage? We need to have a fundamental rethink of how that is working and how well the criminal justice system is working. We also need to think about the recognition within the Australian response to how we talk about what are the causes and the focus of understanding trafficking. Australia has been doing this, like many other countries, for, as I said, around 20 years. There has not been any engagement with the thousands of people who do not want to engage with the criminal justice system. I've spent a lot of my career talking to people who work unlawfully in Australia and other countries. The criminal justice system offers absolutely nothing to people who've experienced exploitation. In Australia, we have no mechanism for remuneration or compensation, but we also have a history and frankly, worldwide recognition for being significantly suspicious of anyone who doesn't have a visa in our country, and even more suspicious of someone who's been working unlawfully. We don't respond by prioritising workers. My consistent and primary concern in this space is that we don't talk about the system of migration and labour law and the ways in which they can reproduce and sustain the conditions within which exploitation is occurring. And as soon as we silo that conversation from the criminal justice system and we rely only on the criminal justice system, the consequence when we think about the elusive nature of impact is that the consequence is the whitewashing of the impact of the failure of the response to attend to exploitation, but also the total whitewashing of the fact that people continue to profit from the labour of people who are exploited, and that exploitation continues unchecked. If we can't think critically about the limitations of a criminal justice model that thinks in a very specific way about an event, about a crime, and in particular about a victim, we will continue to do very little about reducing experiences of exploitation. In Australia, if you are unlawfully in the country, if you don't have a visa to work, or if you've overstayed a visa, or if you have a visa but you don't have work rights, you can't formally, legally have a work contract. But you can, of course, work for somebody. So the consequence of that is that there is no clear recognition, there is no platform to put workers first. And I see this as a consistent and ongoing problem. And in the context of businesses now adopting a commitment to this, I ask them, how will they deal with this issue? We need to really think far more critically about the way in which we sustain, countries like Australia sustain and reproduce these conditions through our institutions of border control in particular. We also need to think about the way the criminal justice system operates, because it's very important to attend to the decisions that prosecution make in terms of what cases go forward. And there's never any on-the-record comment about the targets that the Commonwealth DPP might have, for example, but they do have to put forward cases that have a likelihood of success. And we know consistently, through my research over 20 years nearly, consistently, the problem in the context of trafficking is that the victims and who are the witnesses are bad. And this is part of the broader problem of the criminal justice system, where there is limited evidence. I see this as deeply and inherently connected to the broader questions we have about the failure of the criminal justice system to know what to do with experiences that aren't witnessed by another person, that don't happen in public spaces, where there is no clear documentation that this has occurred, where it's one person's word and experience against another. We need to think carefully about that, and we also need to think carefully about a critical element of the use of deportation, also a critical issue in the UK, in terms of thinking about the focus at the point of identification often fails to recognise that people can and do move through various workplaces, experience various forms of exploitation. In my work, I often speak to people who can map for me various experiences of exploitation, who might have been trafficked to Australia essentially, and then have experienced exploitation and then move on because the work conditions are terrible. We need to think about the way in which the focus within the criminal justice system is the moment of interaction with authorities, as opposed to asking about their broader experiences. And what else can you tell us about working in Australia if you've been doing that? When the focus is on deportation and there is no model for support, for work, for remuneration, we are not putting exploitation first. And this is a fundamental limitation on substantive and impactful change. So I'd like to end there, and I very much welcome questions at the end, of course.
Okay, thank you, Marie, for this engaging presentation, which has focused, as far as I have understood, on the limits of criminalization and on the need to focus much more on exploitation as the basic problem of human trafficking, probably much more than criminalization itself. Okay, I'm sure we will get back to that in the during the discussion. Meanwhile, Vincenzo Militello has shown up. Hi, Vincenzo. And so let me move on to the next speaker, who is Marika McAdam. She's an independent international law and policy advisor who has worked with UNODC, IOM, and other institutions. She is currently serving as an advisor to the Regional Support Office at the Bali Process and ASEAN Australia Counter-Trafficking in South Asia. She has written a lot, many technical publications on human trafficking, migrant smuggling, and related topics. We are very happy to hear what she has to say to us on her today's speech, which is entitled "Putting the Justice Back into the Criminal Justice Approach to Anti-Trafficking." So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro, and hello, colleagues. Lovely to be here, and I don't know whether I'm delighted or terrified to come after Marie, because I find myself in furious agreement with you, Marie. I hope that what I'm offering offers a little bit of a different approach, though, so let's see how we go. But look, essentially, I was going to start by saying, indeed, you know, for a long time, a lot of us have been tearing down the criminal justice system, and actors on these issues and activists have been criticizing the criminal justice approach. Certainly here in the Asia Pacific, where I'm speaking to you from, I'm based in Thailand, but you know, a whole range of offences have been documented. You know, from the prevention point of view, we've spoken about these poorly or even purposefully conceived laws and policies that actually entrench vulnerability in the guise of preventing trafficking. And we've seen that manifest in restrictive migration policies, particularly affecting women. From a protection point of view, we've seen identification and indeed misidentification of people as victims of trafficking, often to their detriment and against their will, where the result is that they're effectively separated from societies and then assisted through programs that reinforce gender stereotypes, don't allow them to integrate into the community, and may end up exacerbating the vulnerability of them, denying them and their families of an income income. And from a prosecution point of view, of course, what we have seen in a bid to increase prosecution rates is low-value convictions of low-level actors, very often being members of vulnerable communities themselves. And what we've seen, as Marie just pointed to, is that very often criminal justice processes are not victim-centered, but instead they place extremely heavy burdens on victim witnesses in the absence of alternative evidence, and this over-reliance on victim testimony. So all of this, in summary, I think we can safely say, has created a thriving counter-trafficking industry, of which I myself am a part, but it has interfered with the rights of migrant workers, sex workers, other marginalized groups, and at the same time has had a questionable impact on reducing exploitation, and in some cases has indeed exacerbated vulnerability to it. So I agree with that assessment, absolutely. But where I perhaps differ with others is that while some people argue that the criminal justice approach is solely to blame for this, my view is that it might be premature to make that call, and that we might need to ask ourselves, are we just perhaps doing it wrong? So at present, one of the concerns I have, and I've been chewing on this for a long time now, is that there seem to be so many counter-trafficking narratives that I'm actually getting quite lost about what the actual narrative is. And often what I see is that those who take a very broad view of what trafficking is, also arguing that trafficking can be a domestic phenomenon and perpetrated by very low-level criminals and by single individual criminals. Yet those same people are the ones that also criticize the counter-trafficking framework for being flawed and targeting the wrong people. So there's a confusing contradiction there. And if the criminal justice system is really to blame and the approach is being too driven by that angle, then why in real terms are there so few convictions? And indeed, in this region and in the Asia Pacific, the conviction rate falls well below the global average. And it's also not clear that any of these are really meaningfully connected to transnational organized crime or have had any kind of disruptive effect. And we know for a fact, according to the most recent data that we have, we know that organized crime groups traffic a higher number of victims for a longer period of time, and they use more violence in doing it. That to me would scream priority. But instead, what we're again seeing is prosecutions of individuals who are branded as traffickers. So my argument then is rather than moving counter-trafficking wholly outside of the criminal justice framework, we need to maybe narrow the purview of what the protocol looks at and focus on transnational organized crime. Now, this is not a revolutionary idea, and in fact, it's an idea that states agreed to when they negotiated this international framework. So it's not about reinterpreting the protocol, it's about reclaiming it. Now, the three protocols are called the Palermo protocols. This is not a coincidence that they were agreed to in Palermo. This was the home of the Sicilian mafia, and Italy was a key driver into campaigning for this framework, and indeed to this day still brings so much expertise when it comes to addressing organized crime. This is useful. As a result of this, the trafficking framework is embedded in this wider context. And for these reasons, incidentally, I'm thrilled that we have Mr. Ferrara on the next panel, who I had the privilege of meeting in Palermo a few years ago. And I'm so glad that so many speakers are going to be addressing these wider issues. So rather, though, than using this framework as it was intended, I think what we've seen is that there's a tendency, certainly in this region, for counter-trafficking actors to place the criminal justice response in opposition to a social justice response, rather than figuring out how they can work in tandem. So the result is that this industry, this counter-trafficking industry, has expanded, as Marie said, to cover all manner of exploitative relationships, irrespective of whether it involves transnational organized crime or not. So, of course, it's unsurprising then that the outcome has been ineffective and indeed detrimental. How is it useful, as Marie said, to prosecute parents who are desperate and devastated for accepting a dowry for their daughter? Why is it useful to prosecute them as traffickers? How is it useful to prosecute as a trafficker a mama-san or a madam who has graduated from sex work herself to now become a manager? How is that how are we disruptively deterring people from situations that they have no alternative to? In the absence then of a concerted effort and political will to address the social justice issues that I think lay the foundations for exploitation, it's actually become a lot easier to just make everything trafficking, because then it avoids that fraught conversation about the inevitability of exploitation in this current political and economic landscape, and pointing to many of the points that Marie raised. So what might then an institutional response look like? Well, my view certainly is that human labor exploitation must primarily be addressed through a rights-based, human rights, social rights-based response. And only the subset of that actually involves transnational organized crime should be where the criminal justice approach that has been offered to us by the protocol should be applied. And this, I think, makes complete sense of the fact that the protocol does not and was never meant to stand separately to the UNTOC. It supplements the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention. But the definition of that is a tool for criminalization. It is not an abstract concept. Every component of it is to criminalize an offense, and that offense is created in the context of the UNTOC. But there are many who use the definition, indeed advocate for it, and yet are very willing to disregard the rest of the instrument. And when one looks at the rest of the instrument, which one should do, it's not very long, it focuses on status of victims in receiving states. It talks about repatriation to origin states, information exchange, law enforcement cooperation, border measures, document controls. In short, this is very clearly, unequivocally, an instrument for international cooperation against transnational organized crime. Now, if that framing has been useful for supporting states to strengthen their domestic institutional response to exploitation, that's a positive. We've certainly documented the list of harms that have resulted from that. But the point is that the trafficking protocol was never meant to make all things trafficking. It was never meant to have criminal justice responses encroach on areas where social justice and human rights and labor law should apply. And it was never meant to be implemented in a way that dilutes resources and distracts from actually addressing transnational organized crime. So I'm not asking then for the criminal justice approach to be completely done away with. What I'm instead asking is that it steps back and steps up. And by steps back, I mean that it should contract, so that the strong response, the strong criminal justice response that it speaks to only applies in that limited context of transnational organized crime. And by step up, I mean that the institutions who are mandated to take that approach step up their capacity to actually do it. Stop targeting low-level actors. Stop calling a prosecution of a madam or a driver or a parent as a success. That's not a success, and we cannot measure response to transnational organized crime on that basis. So the focus has to be on stepping up capacity to actually address organized crime. Now, we've worked so long and so hard to raise awareness that trafficking is not like it looks in the movies, and that it's not always involving these interconnected networks of high-level bad guys who are yielding heaps of money and money laundering through, selling humans. But sometimes it is like that. And in those extreme forms of transnational organized trafficking, which may be just a very small part of it, that's where I think we're talking about a proactive criminal justice response, and that's where it's justified. So, and this is why it makes sense of the fact that the trafficking protocol and its parent instrument call for measures against money laundering, against corruption, confiscation and seizure of assets, international cooperation through extradition, mutual legal assistance, special investigative techniques, law enforcement cooperation, all of these things. Again, I say these are instruments aimed at international cooperation against transnational organized crime, and thus far we have been doing it wrong. So this in mind, if we left cases that don't fall within the scope of the protocol and the UNTOC, if we don't cover them there, then perhaps the result could be that there'd be reduced risk of the wrong people being prosecuted for serious crime. The scarce criminal justice resources that we have wouldn't be spread so thin to have no impact, but could actually be channeled into focusing on a smaller number of high-value, high-impact cases. And criminal justice response could actually be held to account with metrics that aren't just about the number of prosecutions, but about their disruptive effect. I also think that the criminal justice response is here to stay. And the challenge then is to figure out how to make sure that the institutions that it gives work to are doing the work that they're meant to be doing and not detracting, importantly, crucially, from the complementary efforts that we're talking about to address exploitation through human rights and social rights and labor rights and all of those things. Because currently, as I said, I think the counter-trafficking industry has really become a politically convenient mechanism, and it's also become something of a greedy monster. And from a donor perspective, I think donors have to step up their responsibility here, and they have to really support international institutions to actually cultivate and bring to bear specialized expertise. So that would mean, UNODC on transnational organized crime. It would mean the ILO on labor rights. It would mean the IOM on migration rights. Rather than incentivizing everybody to just package everything that they do as trafficking, we could be getting more value for our investment here. So in summary, look, I say again, I'm not blind to the flaws and the failings of what has been done in the name of the criminal justice response. Absolutely not. Including indeed the human rights violations that have resulted. But I think this is a result of the misapplication of the criminal justice response. Criminal justice responses absolutely have to contract and to concretize. And this is not contrary to international law, but is very much in line with it. A key point is not all exploitation is trafficking, and only serious criminality should be met with a serious criminal justice response. Now, this is not to leave unprotected those migrant laborers who are exploited by unscrupulous recruiters, or sex workers who are abused by abusive pimps, or girls who are sold into marriage by desperate parents. Rather, I think it's to allow the trafficking framework to step aside, to allow another response that's more appropriate, and whether that's migrant frameworks, whether it's labor rights, whether it's other criminal laws that aren't trafficking related, including, importantly, protection regimes that don't require a person to be labeled a victim of trafficking in order to access support. And that's a key challenge that we have in many regions. Just to end on a pessimistic note, not that I've been optimistic at all through this conversation, but the ILO and others have predicted that what we're going to see, and I think we're all unsurprised, is an increase in inequality throughout the world. So rising poverty, fewer decent jobs, and I think we can all safely assume there will also be more competition, even for the exploitative jobs. Now, we could make all of this human trafficking, but what would be achieved if we did? And for who? And to what end? So, look, the ship may have sailed on this, but for my part, I hope that it's not too late for a more targeted response to trafficking that hopefully addresses crime as crime, and makes room for rights-based and social justice-based approaches to address the other economic, cultural, social, civil, political dimensions of human exploitation. I'll leave it there. Happy to be on the panel and look forward to discussing with you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marika, for your observations on the limits of criminalization and tackling trafficking, not only as a criminal phenomenon, in fact, but also as a social phenomenon. This is a point on which I would like to raise a question afterwards during the discussion. But now I move on to our next speaker, who is Siru, who is a research officer and lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. Siru's research is interdisciplinary and focuses on gendered labor, migration regulation, human security, exploitation, and criminalization. She has written more recently on counter-trafficking responses in Southeast Asia, and I guess that her speech today will be particularly focused on these topics. The title of her speech is Anti-trafficking in Singapore, the question of impact for women migrant domestic workers. So, Siru, thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. Sorry, is this working? Okay, that's great. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm really fresh and it's quite exciting and nerve-wracking to be here on the panel with people we've been looking at, trafficking work for decades and even longer than that. But what I'll be talking about today, it's something, it's going to be a lot more localized. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on Singapore and on women migrant domestic workers, because that's really what came up. That was really the focus of my PhD research that was recently completed. So I'll be talking more about that. And I think a lot of the points that Marie and Marika raised it's very interesting, and I agree with a lot of them. But just to bring, I think, a slightly different take to the table as well, where we talk about, gendered and intimate labor and, what that actually looks like. So, when I first started out my PhD research, the focus was really on anti-trafficking in Singapore, because I think when we look at anti-trafficking or counter-trafficking, this cause and all the work around it, there's so much talk about, what's happening in Europe and North America, and a lot of what's happening in the global North. And so, because I'm a Singaporean, so I was interested very much, what was happening in my country. As I know that, Singapore has had an anti-trafficking law since March 2015, and then we have a really massive migrant worker population in Singapore as well. In fact, I think our economy would not be able to run without them. So I was interested to see, is this being utilized? How is it being utilized? And so when I first started out, I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that we had one conviction at a time. Because from what I know, convictions are very rare. They don't happen often. And in Singapore, so we recognize sort of three types of trafficking, child trafficking, trafficking for forced labor, and trafficking women for sexual exploitation. So, when I first started out, it sounded quite promising, but whether it was utilized, how it was utilized, was a big question for me. And then when I went in to do my field research, what sort of shocked me very much was that literally no one in the field was talking about trafficking at all. So, and by this, I mean, the workers weren't talking about it, authorities were not talking about it, and NGOs weren't talking about it. So, when I was asking people about, work conditions, exploitation, stuff like that, the word itself, human trafficking, just never ever came up in the conversation unless I brought it up myself. And I thought that was quite interesting, because Singapore does have an anti-trafficking law. We have those frameworks in place. So what's the problem here that we have? And so I think when I then started asking the questions around that, asking authorities and NGO personnel, why we have this, we do have this law, why are we not prosecuting abusive employers under this, and why are we not dealing with scrupulous third-party agencies with this law? And what was actually told to me was there were different stories. So from the side of NGO personnel. So we do have two or three major migrant worker organizations, and then they told me that they had actually recommended or referred several cases to the anti-trafficking team in Singapore. And these were all about women migrant domestic workers. None of them were accepted. And so I was really curious why, because, the sort of focus or, the indicators of human trafficking that Singapore adopted really does align with the conditions of women migrant domestic workers, in terms, specifically in terms of, the mismatch in work or deception in work. So often women migrant domestic workers would come in thinking that they'd be taking care of a baby, and I'd be hearing stories about how they'd be taking care of elderly and 10 other pets at the same time. So this was a big problem. And so I did think that it would lend quite easily, the anti-trafficking frame to the experiences, but that was not the case. So none of the cases were accepted. And when I probed further to ask, why was this the case? Like, is it something wrong with the case that was being referred or not? And according to the NGOs, of course, the case that cases that they referred met all the indicators. But from the side of the government, a lot of the mismatch or a lot of the issues that we talked about in women migrant in domestic work just simply would not meet the criteria for human trafficking case. So, you know, where we talk about force and coercion and not being allowed to leave the premise, which does happen to a lot of women migrant domestic workers, the interpretation, I was told, is very literal. There had to be a lock on the door in order for that case to be considered as the worker not being allowed to leave the premise. And often the indicators that they were looking for were very physical. So it's all physical abuse, physical neglect, and stuff like that. And that was a major problem raised by the NGOs. And so that was on the part of the stakeholders. And then when I spoke to workers who were also a big part of my research, human trafficking was just never on their register as well. So it's something that most of the people I've talked to, it's just something that they have never heard of. They do know about going to the police. They do know about going to the Ministry of Manpower, but they don't know anything about this human trafficking thing. And so I thought there was, you know, quite clearly a gap between this anti-trafficking framework that Singapore has, you know, signed and ratified to, you know, we've put in place all the laws and everything, and what's actually happening on the ground. And, you know, I think I don't think this is unique to Singapore. I think this is something that we see across quite a number of countries. And alongside that, I think this is also something that this is a problem that sits alongside the legal and regulatory frameworks that we have in Singapore. And so it doesn't make it, you know, what the frameworks that workers use or NGOs would use is not the anti-trafficking framework. It would be the labor law framework. But even then, a lot of the labor and migration restrictions that we have in place make it so incredibly difficult for workers to come forward. And a lot of this, you know, are issues that what Marie has spoken about when it comes to the criminalization, or when we choose to take a criminalization approach to dealing with the exploitation of workers. And I think when it comes to the situation or the circumstances of women migrant domestic workers, there is another added layer of the fact that how we understand, you know, bad working conditions, or how we understand exploitation, it's really through an ungendered lens, an ungendered framework. And so, you know, some of the things that were told to me by authorities, so people who would be able to refer the case to ensure that it goes through that criminal trial process, or, you know, even going through a labor law process, what they would say is, you know, things like, oh, you know, if she came here and she was promised that she would have a room to sleep in, or that she would only be taking care of the grandparent in the daytime, and if the responsibilities that she was tasked with goes beyond that, you know, that's just a mismatch of expectations. That's not exploitation. And that is quite endemic of how a lot of the authorities and even the NGO personnel understood the very nature of domestic work, where any and all work that happens in the home, it's considered domestic work. And if there is any sort of you know, difference in expectations between workers and employers, that was considered to be a small and minor problem. And so that is sort of another added layer that we have when it comes to using a criminalization, a criminal justice approach in trying to deal with exploitation that happens in a very intimate and gendered workspace. And that's something that's quite problematic, because the work itself is strongly associated with, and it's strongly grounded in gender norms and expectations around women's domestic work. Being woken up in the middle of the night, working on off days, on their rest days, it's never considered to be something wrong. And if all of those things, all of those situations are not considered to be exploitative, or it's not considered to be abusive, then the question then comes up is, how would a criminal justice framework, or how would any sort of criminalization approach work in this space when everything is reduced and it's dependent on, you know, workers' capacity to sacrifice their rest days, on workers' capacity to, you know, make sacrifices to their employers in order to gain their trust and avoid and building good relationships in order to avoid even further exploitative conditions. And so that is the sort of things that came up in my conversations with workers, with authorities, and with NGO stakeholders. And, you know, so what I think is missing very much when it comes to, you know, alongside the things that Marika and Marie said about the criminalization and criminal justice approach, is how are we understanding all of the work that happens in the care industry, you know, where things like relationships with employers, expectations of employment standards, and, you know, personal interactions, and even their interpretations, both workers and employers' interpretations of, you know, norms and culture around domestic and care work. How are we taking all of that into consideration in our construction of an understanding of exploitation and trafficking? Because that's, I think, something that we see, that I've seen to be quite severely absent, where a lot of our understanding of labor and subsequently exploitation is built on what we know in a public workspace. And that sort of work that happens there, it's very, very different to the sort of work and to the sort of negotiations that happened in the home, where where the worker is dealing not just with that one employer, but all the other family members in the home as well. I mean, my research is strictly constrained to domestic work, but in conversations with, you know, people who have worked in other care industries, this is not an uncommon thing that we see. In fact, it is the very core of their work. And so the thing, I mean, frameworks that sort of talk about having indicators about, okay, this is what labor exploitation is, confiscation of passport, you know, working beyond how many hours, etc., etc. Sure, you know, I think they're incredibly helpful in telling us, okay, you know, this is decent work conditions, this isn't, but they are at the same time very limited, you know, in the capacity to capture and account for this sort of gendered and intimate and care work that we are talking about here. Because the experiences, it's really much more diverse, it's much more relational, and it's so different, where even the very concept of safe work or better living or better work that we are talking about, it's quite different to workers' expectations of what they consider to be safe and secure work, because their understanding is not limited to siloed indicators in labor law frameworks. It is the way that workers understand, you know, what's considered to be safe and sustainable work could easily be a situation where, you know, sure, my employer has taken my passport, or they don't allow me to go out on every single rest day, or sometimes they have compromised particular labor conditions. But at the same time, the way that they treat me on an everyday basis, with respect or with dignity, that changes the whole picture for workers. And I think, you know, to sort of end this, I would just like to add that, and I think when we talk about moving forward in terms of trafficking or even exploitation, that is something that I think we really need to take into consideration more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Siru, for drawing our attention on the problem of exploitation, which is crucial to human trafficking, but as you have shown, is also so elusive and difficult to catch up some aspect. Well, now it's the turn of Caitlyn McGeer, who is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford, and whose doctoral research is focusing on policing responses to smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons. Caitlyn's professional background focuses on capacity building premised on securing welfare and rights protection. Caitlyn, I would like to add, and as Mary has already said, has done a great job along with Sanya in co-organizing this workshop, and I'd like to take advantage of this moment to say thank you. So she will talk to us about policing the crosshairs of criminality and victimhood. So Caitlyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to Mary and Alessandro for providing the opportunity for this great event. I must admit, it feels like quite a heavy task to go after Marie, Marika, and Siru. And I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to load that quickly. But similar to Siru, I'm approaching my presentation from a much more localized perspective, and very much, oh, let me just, okay. Can you see this?
Yes, yes.
There we go. All good? Sorry, I just always have to check because every system is different, but I very much wanted to pick up on some of the themes that Marie, Marika, and Siru were discussing. So Marie gave a really great presentation about sort of the, and one of the things she mentioned was the elusive framework of who is a victim of modern slavery. And Marika very much followed up with that, with sort of questioning, you know, what are we doing wrong in the criminal justice system? And I think Siru highlighted this really, really important distinction between what happens at a policy level and what happens on the ground. And I've somewhat inadvertently prepared my presentation as a little bit of a case study to marry all those three different ideas. So I'm similar to Siru presenting on my doctoral research. So my wider project I've been doing since 2017, which is a little bit long now, but I conducted a sort of large phase of research in the UK and a large phase in Nigeria as well. So why Nigeria and the UK? Well, when I started my research at the time, Nigeria was seen as sort of the hotspot or the source country for the sexual exploitation type of modern slavery, as it's referred to in the UK. And the UK had invested a really, really sort of large sum of money in capacity building from a policing perspective in Nigeria, and working within the UK as well to sort of enhance victim safeguarding for Nigerian victims among all other types of victims as well. So today what I'm going to talk about is my work from the UK perspective. So in the UK, I worked with 8 different police forces. So just to give some context, there's 43 police forces across England and Wales. So 8 is a small number, but I would say it's a notable number. And I worked also with the national response force as well, the National Police Response Force. So across these different forces, there's a wide arrangement of policing action, but it can pretty well be summarized in sort of 3 ways. There's the national level action, which is really focusing on sort of gathering the evidence, enhancing the intelligence basis, more of an advisory role, so operations, tactical responses, strategic responses, and really being a liaison between forces and policymakers. Now at the force level and the local level, which is where I spent sort of most of my research time, the action is a little bit different. So at the force level, it's kind of this hybrid role, doing advising, coordination, and then also working directly on investigation and a large portion of partnership work. But at the local level is where you see sort of the majority of the interaction with victims of modern slavery and offenders, as well as witnesses, and also the responsibility for police in terms of victim care and victim safeguarding. So the question that I really want to focus on today for my presentation is, how do police make determinations of who is a victim of modern slavery? And in the UK, the majority of police interaction with potential victims happens in the course of responding to other crimes. And then they have to identify who is a victim and who is an offender in this context. Now, there's a few other reasons why I think the UK response is particularly important to look at. And one is somewhat classically, the UK has sort of self-asserted that they have the gold standard policing response to modern slavery. Some larger international NGOs have also adopted this language when referring to the modern slavery police response in the UK. Importantly as well, the sort of wider context in the UK of policies about being tough on crime, creating a hostile environment for immigration control, and then also the approach to modern slavery, which the former Prime Minister Theresa May described modern slavery as, the greatest human rights abuse of our time, and requires the immediate safeguarding of victims. So police have these three sort of different and what I argue competing kind of narratives that they're trying to navigate when they're determining victimhood and criminality in the context of modern slavery. So in terms of my findings, I'm just going to pick up on four sort of brief ones. There's a lot more, and if anyone's interested, I would be happy to discuss more about this. So in terms of the perception of victims, the main one is that the victim is weak. So a weak, vulnerable victim that is exploited by a sort of organized offender, organized crime group, something that Marika talked about, and offenders are, they have the strength to exploit. Really largely, all the officers that I worked with use nationality-based language as the way that they identify victims and describe modern slavery as a nationality-on-nationality crime. Therein, there's a really big conflation of race, which is how they identify nationality, with foreignness, and then foreignness with criminality. There were also some really interesting gender differences, sort of similar to what Siru touched on, but in the UK, police largely approach this from sort of quite, large categorization. So, women were almost wholly seen as victims. They were, and therein they were sort of only really recognized as victims in the context of sexual exploitation. Men were largely recognized as victims in labor exploitation, but the sort of nuances in how the labeling process for male victims or potential victims went is something that I want to pick up on, because this is what officers spent sort of a really, really large length of time discussing. So, as I said, the language of the weak and vulnerable victim, this was what had sort of the most traction when describing what a victim is. But when I specifically prompted officers, who is this weak victim? What makes them weak? What makes them vulnerable? It was really interesting to see that officers actually struggled to describe weakness and vulnerability. So the main framing that they had, which Detective Inspector Jones, that's a pseudonym, discusses here is, the question we ask ourselves is, would your average person do this? And, that's kind of in the definition of exploitation, as the officer goes on to say. And this question, although was repeated among sort of many conversations and many interviews with the other officers as well. And police use this question, this kind of logic, to try and understand how the victim has ended up in sort of their predicament. So this average person test, if you will, really allows police to distinguish, the weak who would be vulnerable to trafficking and all others, the strong, who would not be. And then the vulnerability of victims very much becomes defined through reference to what is then abnormal. So this not average in the context of this question here. And in many ways, this description of victimhood really then also places the blame for exploitation on the victim themselves. You know, you could really look at this, if the victim was average, this would not have happened to them. That's kind of inherent in this kind of question and this kind of thinking. So that a legitimate is almost someone who a normal person would not happen to a normal person. So what this really gets at and starts to reflect upon is this sort of legitimacy of a victim's vulnerability framed through weakness, and in this sort of average person context really starts to signal that this is the starting point for police assessments of how they determine who is a legitimate victim. And just to pick up on that, this idea of sort of legitimate victimhood not only was framed through weakness, but also through reference to their exploitation. And this exploitation actually wasn't described in terms of, oh, they've been exploited through these specific mechanisms, but actually through the larger pattern of, oh, they've been exploited by organized crime groups, which further moves away an assessment of a victim's vulnerability or what sort of lived experience has led them to intersect with trafficking, to a sort of much more truth-seeking way of trying to determine vulnerability and victim legitimacy. And my participants really talked about organized crime groups in two kind of competing ways, and competing ways was a theme that carried throughout sort of all my research on this. And in one way, as this kind of quote shows, participants really described organized crime groups as having total power over victims. So these groups prey on again, weak and vulnerable people. You know, they're recruiting victims, gaining their trust. They try and make the victims feel like the offender is doing them a favor. And very much as sort of bolded in their shows, they recognize that organized crime groups are quite sophisticated in the way they work, and they try and create this, as they describe it, a layer of protection between themselves and the police. So the sort of example that Constable Harris gives there is that an organized crime group wouldn't rent a car themselves. They would do it under a victim's name, and many different examples like that to create this confusion between, you know, is this a victim? Is this an offender if they come into contact with police? And while recognizing that, in their sort of descriptions of cases and in looking at case files, so my research involved interviews with the lead officers on modern slavery investigations and the single points of contacts within these 8 forces. And then I was also granted operational data, access to operational data and national referral mechanism case files with one force I partnered with in the UK, and I got that data for over a period of 2 years. And looking at that in combination with the interviews, what you really see is that all of the interaction that officers have with victims, they'll describe scenarios, you know, similar to what they say in this quote. So a victim has rented, or a potential victim in their eyes, has rented a car in their own name. And many scenarios like that. Another classic one is, oh, a victim has topped up their own phone. But instead of recognizing from an investigative standpoint, sort of in the moment or in practice, that this actually is a strategy of organized crime groups, it actually turns police to really question, again, the legitimacy of victims. So really any agency on the part of victims undermines their sort of claim to victimhood from the eyes of the police. And much more broadly, when officers are discussing sort of who is a victim and an offender of modern slavery, they overwhelmingly rely on the language of nationality. And something that, you know, very clearly comes across in many officers said, as I flagged earlier, is this is a nationality on nationality crime in their words. And officers almost like flippantly, for lack of better wording, would throw around sort of nationality descriptors, you know, Hungarians do this, Romanians do this, Vietnamese victims are like this, and so on and so forth. And they had actually mapped those different nationalities onto specific types of exploitation. And I'm not going to talk about that right now, but I can answer some questions if anyone has any about that. But what I want to pick up on is actually the patterns that emerged in how they related nationality to victimhood and the legitimacy of a claim of being a victim. So overwhelmingly, the further officers perceived a victim's home country to be, the more sort of clearly foreign they were seen to be. And officers determined this foreignness based on language differences, cultural differences, and visual cues, so racialized cues. And the greater implication this perceived foreignness had for a victim's status. So if someone was clearly foreign, the police perceived that these victims were much more likely to have come to the UK by way of exploitation by traffickers, so by organized crime groups. And therefore, because they were seen to be weaker victims who otherwise couldn't have traveled to the UK on their own. And interestingly, or not interestingly, unsurprisingly, it was much more easier for the police to capitalize on this safeguarding narrative for these sort of clearly foreign victims. So in these cases, actually, police quite quickly turned away from referencing nationality, referencing organized crime group exploitation, to really focusing on the work that they do to help these victims. So they chronicled at sort of great lengths how they help vulnerable victims, buying them clothes, food, paying for hotel rooms, and with real, pride, they compared how they protect victims of modern slavery to some of the known failings in other police responses. And what was interesting, just I think as an important aside here, is there was 1 month of my research where it was July 2018 to be specific. I actually had access to all of the national operations on modern slavery happening in the UK for that month, and in half of those cases that have modern slavery flags, nationality wasn't recorded for victims, offenders, nor witnesses. So there was just no recording of nationality. So I think there's some really interesting questions there about how police talk about nationality and use it as a way they make sense of who is and who is not a true victim, but they're really not routinely recording that. And while foreignness was largely described as a protective factor related to sort of victim legitimacy for victims from farther away, the closer to home, so the closer to UK that a victim was perceived to be, actually this perception of foreignness was a really big risk factor for victims, and particularly for Black and minority ethnic British nationals, where we saw sort of the repeat of wider racialized patterns in policing that are happening in the UK. So the conflation of race with criminality. And this particularly happened with officers who were working on county lines drug trafficking. They almost exclusively deployed racialized language when discussing British nationals, and in their words, these victims, or they described them as offenders, were Black young boys, and they described these victims as 14 years old at one instance, where at the other instance really aging them to being men, and really talking about them as having great agency in their involvement in organized crimes, in having drugs debt, in having drugs use issues, criminal history, and really wanting this life that, quote, looks good on Instagram. So this idea of sort of extravagance. And really, as this quote shows, the idea of the claiming of victimhood being a smokescreen. So there was no question almost in the officers' minds that these were illegitimate victims. These were most likely offenders. It's particularly notable how officers spoke about Black and minority ethnic British nationals for county lines versus white British nationals, who were really described in terms of vulnerabilities like homelessness, financial debt, mental health, estrangement from families, and that organized crime groups capitalized on these vulnerabilities and filled gaps. So there's a really sort of distinction in the way that's approached. And what we really see, particularly for Black and minority ethnic victims of modern slavery, is this preconceived notion of doubting their legitimacy and then setting about to confirm or deny that notion, and really using a crime-centered sort of truth-seeking approach. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly conclude with 3 main points. So in overall, sort of in what I've described and in my data more widely, police really describe performing a humanitarian role for victims that they deem to be legitimate. And legitimacy in their eyes is a weak victim. And they perform a much more crime control role for these illegitimate victims, so people that they perceive to be offenders involved in county lines, et cetera, et cetera. And police really speak about having this dual capacity to care for victims, save the innocent victim, protect them from the evil organized crime group. But they also speak about victims through doubting their experience. And police really sort of negotiate these labels of who is a victim and who is an offender based on where they situate the truth of an situation rather. And this truth really comes down to sort of race being used as a proxy for nationality, which is then used as a proxy for both victimhood and criminalization. And it reflects sort of a much wider approach, which, Marie and Marika and Siru, and I'm sure everyone else will touch on, is sort of this performative aspect of humanitarian thinking in responses to modern slavery and human trafficking. And I will leave it there. How do I unshare this quickly? Thank you. And looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Caitlyn. I'll wait a few seconds that you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your speech, for you having drawn our attention to the problem, which I find very interesting, of the legitimacy of the victims, and from the perspective of the police, and for having shared the idea that, according to police at least, either you are a completely weak victim, or you're not a victim at all, which is quite curious in a way. So maybe anti-trafficking, but that may be a problem to discuss on. So we have approximately 25 minutes for questions, and we have a question from Sanya. Is it right?
Yes. Hold on. Let me just can you hear me?
Yes, but before giving you the floor, I would merely like to remind that every one of you who would like to raise a question, just use the raised hand function, which you find in the high side of your screen. Okay, Sanya, please.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, and thank you to all the speakers. That was a fabulous start of the day. I've really learned a lot, and it just made me think quite a lot about my work. And obviously, Marie and I have been working closely on these issues for a number of years. But okay, so I don't know actually how to frame this question, but I think at one point Marika said at the end of your presentation, I think Marika said that you think that the ship has sailed, and that made me laugh out loud a bit, because that's sort of my sentiment lately. Those of you who know me know that I'm a super positive, optimistic kind of positive person, but I'm kind of starting to be a bit delusional when it comes to the trafficking content, I have to be honest. Hopefully today's debate is going to change that and flip me where I need to be. But the question basically is this: has the ship really sailed? And I suppose more in the context of how to get all these critical messages through, critical messages about what we're doing so far is not good enough, or that we need to target criminal justice responses in a certain way, or that we see all these problems that Caitlyn and Siru talked about who's the victim and who's not, and how do we basically, given the current approach where everything is trafficking and slavery, and given the resistance of existing stereotypes and myths about trafficking that we've been writing about for over 20 years, what is your take from your local context, I suppose, in your local, within your research portfolios, internationally, I suppose, Marika, when you talk about international response, how do we catch that ship again? How do we get this critical message through, given this, incredible resistance and towards to actually, to all that you're talking about? And that is the very, very blurby question from me for you, all of you today. Thank you.
So we can follow the same order of the presentations. So Marie, would you like to?
Well, that's a great question. It's a complex question, to be honest with you. Well, a complex answer. I think there are significant concerns, I think, that the focus on modern slavery and the push away from specificity and the repetition of the same model again and again over 20 years suggests that in many ways, perhaps, yes, the ship has sailed. But where I see opportunity and reform is outside of the criminal justice system and through much larger mechanisms that emphasise labour and migration, and through international commitments to prioritising those much broader considerations. I think Marika's right to remind us of the foundational framework and that it was never fit for this purpose, and this constant extension into various forms of exploitation that the very narrow response is utterly inadequate at dealing with. And I think it's very difficult to see nations embrace imagination and creativity in relation to this, but also to recognise that the institutions that we rely on, particularly the criminal justice system, is inherently racialised and reproduces gender inequality. So we already have very major problems with those systems. So I look to some of the work from colleagues from ILO and those kinds of mechanisms that are pushing forward a much broader expansion of the recognition of workers and workers' rights. Some of the broader concerns that I have around the persistence of migration control and borders and exclusion and exclusionary practices, I think, are going to, in fact, potentially increase. And that is a significant and deep worry, which is a very negative response.
Okay, thank you. Marika, have you something to add?
Yeah, great question, Sanya. And yes to all of the above. I think what Marie says is absolutely right. But I also do, this is me looking for optimism, but I actually do think there's a lot of scope for us to do better also within the criminal justice system. And what does that look like in practical terms? And by the way, this is a question I have to ask myself all the time because I'm so often working with criminal justice practitioners. I think first lesson is that the response has to be calibrated to the context. Every country looks different. Every country is at a different phase of its response. And listening to Siru talk about, where things are at in Singapore with under-identification, I'm thinking, great, okay, what can Singapore learn then about avoiding traps of misidentification and on that trajectory of counter-trafficking, how can we be learning from the mistakes of others? But more practically, what it looks like to me is when I'm working on criminal justice response. Once upon a time, all we were doing was building capacity of prosecutors to prosecute. That's wrong. If we're going to do that, we also have to build capacity of defense lawyers. It has to be that balance. And this is what I mean by putting kind of a rights-based thinking into criminal justice responses. We have so much further to go on that to make sure that when we're talking about victim-centered approaches, we're, victim by its nature is a criminal justice term. Okay, so we have to make sure that we're taking, a victim-centered approach within the criminal justice system. And that, of course, logically means things like reducing the burden on them. And what can we learn from the system that we have? Well, the emphasis on special investigative techniques, putting an emphasis on trying to make sure that people have the capacity to gather evidence that doesn't require us to stick a victim in a shelter for up to a year just so we can get their testimony. And what do they get out of it? Nothing. So there's so much that we can do within the system to be a lot better. And this whole, when I was listening to my colleagues on the panel speaking, I was trying to think of any other crime that interrogates the victim so much. And what Caitlyn was talking about was absolutely fascinating. And I think we've misinterpreted this victim-centered approach to be this obsession with victims and trying to identify a crime on the basis of what the hell the victim's done. This is bonkers. I mean, return again to the definition of trafficking. We're talking about a crime, the actus reus and the mens rea of the trafficker. We want to figure out what they're doing. What is their criminal action? What is their criminal intention? This distraction onto the victim has got us into the situation that Caitlyn so well illustrated of looking at, the perfect ideal victim who, didn't want a bar of it, has nothing to gain from being exploited, even though we know the truth. It's so rarely like that. But that doesn't detract from the culpability of the criminal. So again, this is why I haven't, the ship has sailed, as I said, the criminal justice system is here to stay. But we are, I think, if we just accept that fact, embrace what we've learned about its limitations and its flaws, there is still so much we can do to make criminal justice approaches rights-based and to strengthen them. And even, another basic example, we're looking at the prosecution, Caitlyn's example of the county lines cases where these victims are so instantly dismissed. This is a call to reinforce the non-punishment principle in the trafficking framework. And there's been so much great thinking around that, but what does that mean in practice? And again, these are still tools within the world of criminal justice. So ship has sailed, there's my pessimism. Lots we can still do. There's my optimism, and I guess there's my call and my hope about how we can move forward. Great question, Sonia.
Thank you, Marika. What you said reminds me of rape cases in which, happens pretty much the same, that prosecutors are much more concerned on, obsessed with what victims have done than with what perpetrators have done. A good point. Siru, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think Maria and Marika's really, sort of encapsulated my sentiments to its criminal justice approach and criminalization, which is, the dominant model at the moment. And I think Sonia's question is very timely. It's something that I've been thinking about, what can we do, especially when it comes to the conclusion that I came to at the end of my research is that we really need to change the conversation around domestic work and gendered labor and care work. And that's such a huge project. So, where do we start? Where can we start? And I think, I'm probably not as pessimistic as Marie, I'm trying to be a bit more optimistic. And I think the first thing I think when it comes to women migrant domestic workers, more specifically, I can't say that I think anti-trafficking framework, the way it is at the moment, is going to be effective for them, or it's going to be in any way useful for them, without, first having us talk about some of the very underlying issues that are present. And the very pertinent one is that the dismissal of issues that workers find important versus what authorities find to be important. And I think if we don't talk about that, and we don't talk about gendered labor, and our expectations around that, the norms that underpin that, I think it's very hard for us to move forward. And so I think if we want to talk about moving forward, empirical work that firstly prioritize what and recognizing what this women value, how they negotiate their environments, what they consider to be safe and sustainable, needs to take priority. I think, especially in the context in Singapore, where often change is often top down instead of bottom up, and that's a problem I see. That's to be quite pertinent in Singapore and in Hong Kong, which was the other place where I did my research. But they play a very important part in challenging, our very static categories and definitions that have been used to define their experiences, used to define, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, this qualifies for you to be a victim and this doesn't. And that's alongside all of the other things that Marika has talked about in terms of making the protections accessible for victims. That's, I think, really what, from my own research, this is what I see to be quite important. And on a sort of different note, I think with COVID, with everyone staying at home, working from home, this might sound terrible, but I think seeing all the conversations that we're having about women's work in the home and how hard it is to juggle both work and domestic work, I think this could be a good chance for us to start having this important conversations about gendered labor and women's labor, which I think would help in sort of pushing forward a labor and human rights sort of framework that we're talking about, to making sure that this comes at the forefront of our considerations as well, alongside all of the other sort of institutional changes that is also incredibly important.
Thank you, Siru. And this leads to Caitlyn. Do you have a word?
I mean, I'll just echo what everyone else said, but I do just want to pick up on something that Marika raised, which was almost how we can innovate victim care, or how we can really sort of push this agenda forward. And one of the things that sort of I find myself encountering a lot in my work and really questioning is sort of the illusion of partnership work as the way to do this. And I think inherent and I'm specifically talking from a policing perspective, so criminal justice perspective here, partnership work is, something that they have to do. It's the way forward. It's the right way to do it. But inherent in the way that partnership work is approached is sort of this asymmetry in power, where actually, there can be a lot of information that's passed from sort of the partners to police, but police still have the sort of limits or the authority on how they use that information. So I think part of this sort of reimagining the way that we could enhance victim care within the criminal justice system really comes to sort of how can we embed sort of the ethos of the partnership approach in policing itself, and what does that look like? And I think there's been real innovation in this in some other countries for how we can have victim care officers actually on trafficking teams, and that these are independent sort of civilians that have this role and that are called out. And I think part of that too is that there is a very sort of disjointed approach sort of at a national level. So it's kind of like a lottery if you're a victim, which force you might be picked up by. Some of them have very, very well developed victim care. Some have, completely atrocious victim care. So how at a national level can we go about creating a much more cohesive framework for victim safeguarding?
Okay, thank you, Caitlyn. I guess Mary wants to raise a question. Is it right?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. That was a super interesting panel. My question is for Marika, although sorry, I think we're all pronouncing your name differently, but anyway, and obviously anyone else could jump in. I was struck by what you were saying about this this focus on the victim and how that seems to be part of the problem. And then Marika, you were suggesting that there should be more of a focus not only on the perpetrators, but actually on this idea of thinking about thinking about trafficking as a transnational organized crime, if I understood you rightly. And I suppose I was just thinking when you were talking about that, and when I was listening to all the papers, about how would you mitigate against some of the risks that might be attendant in the issues that Caitlyn and Siru raised, in particular around race and gender. And so while their work was focused on the victims, you could imagine those same qualities structuring police views and prosecutors' views of offenders. And I was thinking here of work by Gabriela Sanchez on smuggling. Is there a danger that maybe we move from thinking about victims, all things being trafficking, if we're looking at victims, if we move it to perpetrators, do we start to see all things as organized crime rather than, something else? And would that risk pulling back in, the sort of family members who move people across borders, all of that sort of stuff? So I guess I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about what it might mean to focus more on perpetrators, what it might mean to focus more on a sort of serious transnational organized crime, and how, if we did that, you'd avoid replicating the race and gender biases that seem to be evident in the system as it currently is.
Amazing question, Mary, and thank you for the question. Thank you for convening us. This is a great opportunity. Look, all of those risks, I think, are profoundly real. There is zero question that would be the case. But as I said, I'm not making a novel proposition here. The scope of purpose of the protocol is transnational organized crime. Everything that you're talking about, I think, goes back to my previous answer. These all speak to the things that we need to do better within this criminal justice approach. And the risks that you're mentioning, I don't think are specific to trafficking in persons. These are across the board. The thing that differentiates, if we're looking at this internationally, then of course we are looking at a range of nationalities, and the data that we have does suggest that there are some racial and national patterns there, which stands to reason. If we're talking about recruitment by same language groups, we're talking about trust that is built through same ethnic groups. So all of that would almost be unavoidable when we're talking about a criminal justice approach that likes to profile for the purpose of crime prevention. But again, taking a rights-based approach to this, I think, speaks to some of the things that we can do to mitigate some of those risks, including these notions about vulnerability. And we are all banging on and on and on about vulnerability because it's just such an exciting thing to do, because the protocol invited us to by looking at abuse of a position of vulnerability as a means of trafficking. And we know that it is probably the most commonly used means, above force, above violence. So we're invited to look at that. But when we're talking about trafficking, I think a key reality in it is that vulnerability to being trafficked, similar factors involved in vulnerability to becoming a trafficker. So if we're taking a criminal justice response, that means a crime prevention response, which means getting ahead of it, which again, the protocol invites us to do. It invites us to try to confront trafficking before the point of exploitation. How do we do that? We need to know more about it. And that means we need to know more about who's doing it. So I would be the last person to say, let's not disaggregate data on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, all of it. We need to look at it, but we need to look at it in a meaningful way that paints a picture that we can take effective action on. And so again, I think every risk that you raised is an absolutely critical one. But again, we're better placed to confront that now, particularly, as I just mentioned, with things like the non-punishment principle. If our focus is on traffickers, then perhaps what we'll do in that is say, hang on a second, you're not actually that much of a bad guy. You actually may fall within the victim category, on you go. And as I said, my call is really to look at the very serious organized crime. And I think I'm coming from a place of, my early career a long time ago was really criminal justicey. So I've spent so much time hearing the absolute horror stories, the movie stuff. And so we know it exists. We don't know the scale of it, but we know it exists. All the rest of this, we know how messed up we can get if we're going out there, guns firing, without embedding it into this wider context. So, and by the way, the fact that you've already just canvassed that list of risks suggests that maybe we're not standing in such a bad place to return to these roots of the protocol that invite us to do all sorts of fantastic things. And to the haters of the protocol, I invite you to accept that it's there, and I invite you to look at it creatively. There's a savings clause that reinforces, a complicity with the rest of international law. That means human rights law. That means CEDAW, that means CAT, that means all of these things that we haven't got anywhere near exploring the opportunity of. So that is the journey I think we need to take. Accept that it's here to stay, and do a much better job of it, and do a much better job of working with people who are doing the other things, so we know who to refer things to. If we're looking at something that's not transnational organised crime, but there's still a situation where people need help, they need recourse, they need access to justice, we need to be able to plug into that and refer them, and therefore build a cohesive system. And yes, I will be well retired by the time we're actually doing any of this in a meaningful way. It's Marika, by the way. Not that I mind the other pronunciations.
Thank you.
Okay, I had a question, but I'm afraid it was a too abstract to a typical criminal law theorist question to be answered in a few seconds by anyone. So I would stop this session here. I thank very, very much our speakers. They have given to us much food for thought. And so I say thank you, yes, and applause. And I give the floor to Mary, in fact, for the second panel.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, and thank you for our first four speakers. I know it's rather late in most of the places where you are, but I hope you might be able to stick around for some of our next panel. So I invite the speakers on our next panel, which we have labelled as lived experiences, to turn their cameras on. So that is Chervine, Oftadeh, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing names, Gianluca, Gatta, and I think we will be joined shortly by Calogero Ferrara. Is that right? But he's not here yet, I believe, because of prior engagement. And as I said at the beginning, I'm afraid we are not going to be joined by Bandana Patanayak, which is a shame, if only because we appear to have a panel of men. We started with a panel of women, and now we have a panel of men. Luckily, Alessandro and I switched the chairing roles because that would be considered very problematic. Anyway, so we will follow the same format as the first panel, but obviously with this one, because we're missing one speaker, the speakers can take a couple of extra minutes if they would like. Chervine is going to start us off, so I shall just introduce him. Chervine Oftadeh works as an associate expert with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, in Nigeria. And before joining UNODC, Chervine worked at the Embassy of France in Benin and with several non-governmental organizations in Paris and The Hague on issues related to human rights, the rule of law, and international justice. He holds a master's degree in law from the Panthéon-Sorbonne University in Paris. The title of Chervine's talk is the UNODC Global Report in Trafficking in Persons. And I understand, Chervine, you have a PowerPoint, so hopefully you will be able to share your screen and do all of that. And I will mute myself, and the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Maria. I was looking for my PowerPoint, so I think I'm uploading it now. But let me know if you can see it. Not yet. Okay, so we'll do this differently. All right, so maybe I will just share my screen.
I think that works easier. That's what Caitlyn did.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There we go. Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And yes, my presentation will be on UNODC recent global report. This was published in February 2021. So I thought that it would be good to present these findings now because they're still very relevant, with a specific focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Because obviously, we're working with UNODC Nigeria. That's the region on which I have the main expertise. So without losing any more time, can you see now the new slide? Just checking that the slides are, yeah, okay, great. Okay. So the UNODC Global Report, just a few words for those who may not be aware. This is a report that UNODC is publishing every 2 or 3 years that covers now 148 countries, and the data that we have for this report is the data from 2016 to 2018. So basically for countries where we have available data for 2018, that's what we have. In some countries, it's more difficult, so we take the most recent data that we have. So as you can see on this slide, it covers quite a lot of countries. In Africa, there are some missing countries, but most of them are still covered. So the data is quite representative. So on the victims that we see, on the profile of the victims, based on the data that we have, and maybe just a quick word on the data that we collect, is mostly the data from our national agencies in charge of trafficking in persons. So for example, in Nigeria, we have the NAPTIP, National Agency for the Prohibition of Trafficking in Persons. We collected their data for building this report, and that's what we do with all countries. So based on the data that we have received from the different countries, as you can see on the left, the majority of victims are women, almost half of them. But when we look at the sub-Saharan Africa, this changes a little bit, and actually children represent more than half, and actually close to 60% of the victims in the continent. So you can see that there's this quite difference where we see that child trafficking is much more prevalent in sub-Saharan African countries, but I will go into more details on that a bit later. In terms of the flows out of sub-Saharan Africa, so as you can see, in this slide, what we see, is like the share of victims from sub-Saharan African countries in other regions. So the two regions I wanted to focus on are North Africa and Middle East, and Western Europe. North Africa and the Middle East, you can see that 37% of victims of trafficking detected in that region come from sub-Saharan African countries. That constitutes a significant increase compared to the last global report that we had published in 2018, and that covered data up to 2016. At that time, only 11% of victims detected in the MENA region were from sub-Saharan countries, and now it's up to 37%. Most of them are from Eastern Africa, but in West Africa, there are increasing reports of people from West Africa being trafficked to that region. Then when it comes to Western Europe, the percentage is relatively similar to our last global report. So 20% of victims detected in Western Europe comes from sub-Saharan African countries. And here, because I work in Nigeria, I wanted to say a specific point when it comes to the Nigerian victims. The European Union published its third report on human trafficking in the European Union back in October 2020. The data that it covered was from 2017 and 2018, and it showed that Nigerian victims represented close to 20% of all victims of trafficking detected in EU countries. 90% of the Nigerian victims were women, and close to 70% of the Nigerian victims detected in the EU were trafficked for sexual exploitation. And that shows something that is very strong in terms of like the share of Nigerian that has been discussed, and there has been a lot of research on that. I'm sure you know about that on the Nigerian networks and Nigerian victims in Europe. But I wanted to highlight this this specific point when it comes to the flows. Again, I won't spend too much time on this graph, but you can see the origins of trafficking victims in North Africa. So here it's a bit more diverse, where we have a lot of North African victims, but also West African and even East African citizens that are detected in North Africa. And then in East Africa, most of the victims detected comes from the region, but you still see also a share of citizens from West and Southern Africa. And this graph, again, because I work in Nigeria, of course, I want to make a specific focus on West Africa. You see that 100%, so all victims detected in West Africa are West African citizens. And I wanted to insist on that point because a lot of attention and a lot of focus has been made on trafficking victims in destination countries in Europe or in North America or in other regions. But it is very critical to also tackle the issue at the sub-regional level in West Africa, because the issue is also real here. We don't only have victims that are basically transnational victims. As you can see here, 92% of the victims are within the region or within their own country in West Africa. So when we look at the form of exploitation, as you can see globally, the main form of exploitation for half of the cases is sexual exploitation. But when we look at the sub-Saharan African, the share of forced labor is huge. Close to 80% of victims in sub-Saharan African countries are exploited, are trafficked for forced labor. This is again an increase compared to our last global report, when the share of forced labor in sub-Saharan countries was 63%. So we have again quite an interesting increase when it comes to that form of exploitation. And then obviously sexual exploitation comes second, but if I may say, only 20% compared to the number of victims detected for forced labor. So in terms of the forced labor, if we have a specific look, and I invite you to have a look at our report, there is a specific chapter dedicated to forced labor. And here what we can see is that there are a series of risk factors when it comes to forced labor. And what is very interesting, and maybe in the panel we can discuss that later, but is with the COVID-19, there is a real risk that these factors may be even more aggravated in terms of the economic recession and to migrate elsewhere for opportunities, etc. That may create, with the COVID-19, it may even increase the risk of being trafficked for forced labor. Here we look at what we had done in this global report, is that we also try to look at the trafficking and compare it to the income of the countries. And here you have two very straightforward graphs. The one on the left gives you the share of detected victims by age and national income. And here, what you can see is that for the more the country is has difficulties in terms of like the income, so the poorer the country is, if I may put it that way, the more child labor is going to be prevalent. On the right side of the slide, here we see the share of detected child victims of trafficking by form of exploitation. And here, what we see is that forced labor is going to be the share of victims of forced labor is stronger when we go into low-income countries, and that's particularly true for West African countries, as we're going to see now. So here you have the number of detected victims of trafficking in sub-Saharan countries by form of exploitation, and by sub-region. So as you can see, West Africa, the share in West Africa is massive. Most victims detected in Africa are detected in Western African countries, and most of the victims, as we've seen earlier, were trafficked for forced labor. And here we look at the more detail, depending on the age. And as you can see, child labor is very, very worrying in West Africa. It's close to 80% of total victims detected in the region that are young boys and girls. And you can see that it's quite different when we look at East Africa and Southern Africa. In East Africa, it's mostly men. In West Africa, men are by far the lowest share of trafficked victims. So now, just a few words on the criminal justice response, and especially, of course, with UNODC, this is an important point for us. So you can see that the average victim detection rate, you have the global average, then we compared it with North Africa and the Middle East, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. So you see that in Sub-Saharan Africa, or in the recent times, the victim detection rate has been relatively stable, and it has actually even decreased, unfortunately, in the last couple of years. Let's see how it goes now in 2019 and 2020, but it's still particularly low compared to the global average. And in the conviction, this is particularly the same trend that we have. You see that the conviction rate, the average conviction rate in Sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest globally. And despite significant efforts in recent years, we haven't seen an increase that we can see, for example, in North Africa and the Middle East, where between, as you can see, 2014 and 2018, there has been a huge increase in the conviction rate. In Sub-Saharan Africa countries, for example, in Nigeria, that's the case. The conviction rate compared to the number of cases identified and being investigated and prosecuted is still very low. On the profile of the traffickers, I just wanted to say a few words on the share of women. Usually, and that's also the case in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's mainly men that are convicted for trafficking in persons, but West Africa is the region where we have the highest share of women, and that is approximately 40%. So that's something also that is quite interesting and very different from the global average. And then we mentioned the organized crime groups a bit in the first panel. So here, what you can see is that when organized crime groups are involved, you have more victims that are trafficked for longer periods and across wider distance and with more violence. So I'm not going to the detail of that panel of that graph because I think I'm a bit pressed by time. But you can see that depending on the trafficking group, if it's an organized crime group, so you have more traffickers, more victims, and you can see that the duration of the trafficking is much higher than when victims are being trafficked by individual traffickers. Similarly, here I wanted to show you that that infographic that shows that actually when we talk about individual traffickers, that only cover 11% of victims of trafficking worldwide. While when we come to the organized crime group, such as the business enterprise type of criminal groups or the governance type of organized criminal groups, that's close to I mean, over actually 70% of victims being trafficked are being trafficked by these kind of groups. On these analysis of the role of the organized crime group, this has been based on an analysis of 400 cases of trafficking globally. So it's not only covering Sub-Saharan Africa. This is more global, but it also includes some countries of Sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't speak too much, Mary. But I'm remain open also, of course, for for questions, especially if it concerns Nigeria or West Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chervine. That was perfect and perfectly timed. So if you could stop sharing your screen, then we can go on to the next speaker, who I shall introduce now. Our next speaker is Gianluca Gatta. Gianluca holds a PhD from the University of Naples L'Orientale. His doctoral research, based on fieldwork carried out in Lampedusa in 2005, focused on the treatment of migrants on their arrival. Gianluca worked at the universities of Naples, L'Orientale, Calabria, and Naples Federico II. Gosh, it's all very complicated. And the Archive of Migrant Memories Association, of which he is co-founder. More recently, he worked as project associate professor at the Graduate School of Intercultural Studies of Kobe University in Japan, and was principal investigator for the Horizon 2020 project, Interconnecting Histories and Archives for Migrant Agency. Gianluca's work focuses on migration, body, power, production of illegality, third spaces and sociability, memory, self-narration, and migrant subjectivity. Today, the title of his talk is Border Crossing and Self-Narrative Practices, the Listening Experience of the Archive of Migrant Memories. Thank you, Gianluca.
Thank you very much, Mary. So let me share my screen. Can you see it? Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And
sorry,
thanks for inviting me. Yes?
It's not on the slideshow version. We can still see all of them. I think.
Yeah, now maybe it should change now because I changed it. I enlarged the screen. Maybe,
we're not. We're seeing all the slides.
Let's check now. No?
No.
Strange. Let me do this. Is it okay?
No, nothing's changing. We still see.
We're
still seeing the viewers.
Sorry, let me try again. Okay, stop sharing and open it again. Maybe now?
Yes, now. That's fine.
It's okay? Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you.
So thank you too, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm learning a lot, and thanks for letting me share my research experience and especially my work with the Archive of Migrant Memories. My talk won't focus on trafficking as a specific topic because I have no specific expertise on these. I work more on smuggling and especially on more general approach to migration. But I think that my presentation on the meaning of self-narration and listening in the field of migration, of course, might be of interest if we want to explore the, let's say, the communicative water in which trafficking is framed and it occurs. So I will start with a short introduction about the concept of self-narration, and then I will provide you with some short examples drawn from my association experience in video making, especially in the participatory documentaries. And then I'll discuss some key issues concerning these materials and the general process of narrating and listening. Let me start with the distinction between what people narrate on one side and the circumstances for their voice to emerge and be heard. These are two different things. And very often we focus only on the contents of narration. A focus on the circumstances is less common. This distinction reflects another one, that between products and performances on one side, and process and context on the other. How narration occurs and in which context, which are the limits and the possibilities for people to be heard. This very general distinction is also related to another important, very important issue, such as the passage from face-to-face situated encounters where people feel comfortable in speaking about themselves because there are some concrete people in front of them who are ready to carefully listen to their stories. A passage from this situation to a broader public sphere, so the mediation of their stories in a more uncontrolled, towards a more uncontrolled audience. And this passage is very important in shaping the common sense of migration. And I think that it's very important when we talk about trafficking and the narration of trafficking. But let me focus more on the concept of self-narration before exploring some concrete examples. Of course, self-narration is talking about themselves, but I think that we should. It's not just mean. It doesn't just mean describing or representing the migration phenomenon itself, but also a process of self-reflection, critical self-reflection carried out by its protagonists. The reflexive layer of the account of migration experience is very important. This is the first point, so content and reflection on how narration occurs. The second point regards the relationship between research participants and researchers. This distinction should be somehow overcome, not completely, of course, but somehow overcome, especially the distinction between participants as conceived as source providers and researchers as interpreters. This division of labor should be challenged, in my opinion. This entails promoting a circular reciprocity between the two positions, which acknowledges the different roles, but involves everyone as both listeners and narrators in a common process of knowledge production and fair use of the results of such encounter. The third point regards participation, and self-narration is often associated with participatory methods. But according to our approach, participation ought not to be restricted to the very act of self-narrating, again, just asking people to tell their story and labeling these as participation. I think that participation should be extended also to the archiving and dissemination phase of the social life of the cultural objects produced by the narrators. So people involved in self-narrating should be able to decide how to use, where to use, when to use their narrations. It's not so common, especially in the mainstream media communication. So this is a very general outline of this concept, but I would like to test it by analyzing some examples. The first one regards participatory video projects, some participatory video projects with migrants in Lampedusa. Let me say that personally I have an experience of fieldwork there, as it's been said in the introduction. Lampedusa now is a very famous place, a very overrepresented place. It's a saturated signifier today. But when I started in 2005, it was quite different, but that's not the point. The point is, who represents Lampedusa? The archive of migrant memories tried in the past to break, to interfere with the common sense, the mainstream common sense representation of the island and the migration phenomenon there, produced by external observers, journalists, many. And we carried out some activities there involving migrants who had arrived there a few years before. And the first example is this documentary, Nothing But the Sea, Soltanto il Mare, produced in 2011 and directed by the Ethiopian filmmaker Dagmawi Mer, arrived in Lampedusa in 2006. He was the first migrant to return to Lampedusa in order to represent the island from his point of view. In this film, Dagmawi draws a link between freedom of movement, memory, and identity. And he was allowed to be there because he obtained a document. So this is the legal framework which allowed him to do that. And so that's why he can remember his first arrival while roaming the island and reflecting on his own identification with places, languages, and social networks. But in this film, I think this is the interesting point. Dagmawi not only talks about himself, his work is a self-narration because he expresses his point of view, but also on the lives of other people. In fact, in this film, he also interviews local people and collects stories from them. So here we have a complex definition of migrant memories. We used to translate the Italian name of the association, Archivio delle Memorie Migranti, into Archive of Migrant Memories. We don't use memories of migrants because we think that we not only talk about memories of migrants, which express subjectivity, individual point of view, and so on, but also we collect moving memories. This means that memories of people on the move also call national memories into question by including and triggering a reflection on immigration, the links between immigration, colonial experience, and so forth. And so we have individual and collective dynamics at stake here. It's interesting that Dagmawi's positioning created a surprise effect in many people. Here we have a very clear example. During the shooting of the film, Dagmawi was lucky enough to find on the island the same Coast Guard boat that rescued him at the sea some year before. So he asked for a meeting with the crew, and the emotional outcome of that encounter is very visible in the film. But what's strong here is the surprise of the captain of the boat when he says, "I honestly didn't expect it." It's a very simple statement, but at the same time, it's very telling. Why didn't he expect it? Which is the more general framework that makes sense of this statement. Why does a person on the other side of the migration process not expect that a migrant can be a storyteller, an interviewer? So there's a sort of symbolic rearticulation of political, cultural, and social borders here. Another example is that of Mohammed Aman, also in the framework of a Return to Lampedusa project carried out later in 2012. Mohammed is a former military official in Eritrea and escaped from the so-called military slavery in mid-2000s. During the project, Mohammed visits some places of the island and writes his diary. And now I would like to read some excerpt from it. The first one regards the visit itself, and he says, "Have been lucky enough to see Lampedusa again 4 years after I first came ashore. When I got on the plane, my heart was beating fast, and I started thinking about myself and about the difference between my first landing and there and now. This time, I'm returning with my own identity, a legal document, knowledge of the Italian language, a free man in his own name." The concept of name is very important in self-narration. Then he visits the Lampedusa camp from outside, from a hill, and says, "I only thought about the location of the identification at the expulsion center on my return. I wondered just how invisible we must have been from outside." Here we have an inversion of the positioning. From inside, he couldn't see what was outside, and now he reflects on himself there. The description of the camp regards an exceptional space. The next example regards a common place, a place of sociability, the Bar Royal in Lampedusa, in front of Town Hall. And here Mohammed comments, "When I saw it, I was amazed to see a bar that had a link to my past life. When I was younger, in my home city of Asmara, there was a bar called Bar Royal, where most young people of my age used to meet up and have a coffee. I have discovered that Bar Royal in Lampedusa, just like its namesake in Asmara, is a very important bar in terms of social and political life. The two places are very similar." Here, this point I think is very important because it's not just about migratory experience, the journey, the well-known experience of violence, border crossing, but also the memory connection of different places and times, including the colonial memory. The Bar Royal was there because of the colonial Italian presence there. So in this example, we have a public sphere, a public space, sociability, which is not just general sociality, but might be defined as the interaction for the pure pleasure of spending time among other people, both known and strangers. Then we have a memory, as you have seen, and public sphere. So then, I think that the position of the place in the public and political space is relevant here. All these aspects of this kind of narrations, all these aspects are quite underestimated and underrepresented in the mainstream accounts of migration experience, in my opinion. The question is, what made these kinds of narration possible? And the answer can be the listening context, the way other people listen to these people's creative way of reflecting on their own experience in broader terms. The idea is that high quality listening was activated in the relationship with these people. And this entails the importance of exploring the broader communicative and interactive context in which migration stories are listened and framed. I have some final remarks about this. What is important for the archive of migrant memories is acknowledging the ambivalence of human experience. The concept of ambivalence is very difficult to combine with the legal framework, with the political decisions, but I think it's very important that the broader public sphere included. We know that the effort of practitioners such as lawyers, psychologists, physicians, who work on specific individual cases by listening to the people they assist is fundamental and has very concrete effects on the everyday lives of people, and sometimes also even guaranteeing their legal, mental, and physical survival. But I think that in order to reach a more systemic understanding of the dynamics at stake in migratory process, a reflection on the situatedness of listening practices is needed in order to recognize the agency of migrants. Where are people listened to? By whom? For what purpose? With what consequences are very important questions. So the work of AMM aims to explore the possibility of a debureaucratized and demedicalized space of listening, which might contribute both to make the persons who tell the stories gain a sense of home in the new context in which they find themselves, and to leave a trace of those passages in the broader public sphere, in order to increase awareness of the migration process by including the narration, in the narration also the ambivalence of those experiences. Is it possible to talk about migrants laughing during their border crossing? This is one provocative question, and this is what we try to do in our account of their experiences. Quite often, migrants are asked to be clear, to be transparent, linear in providing an account of their own experiences. It has been mentioned before about the concept of victim. They must be victims in order to be recognized as refugees or trafficked people. And these force their narration into very limited structures of meanings. So I don't know if this can be avoided. I suppose not. But my idea is that in parallel with this kind of selective listening by institutional structures, medical, psychological, legal, we need more open and encompassing forms of listening. Because the act of narrating to someone else, sorry, I forgot. Okay. The act of narrating to someone else plays a fundamental role in structuring the narrator's experience, in giving meaning to the circumstances of her or his life. We cannot acquire a full understanding of our experience without talking about it, without sharing it with others. So, but each listening context has its own rules, aims, limits, procedures, which strongly affect the narrative outcome. So the listener, which is positioned in terms of many variables, gender, class, ethnic, cultural identification, political beliefs, but also personal attitudes, actively contributes to that process of memory formation through narration. So a limited, selective, conditioned listening produces extremely impoverished and domesticated memories, which cannot really contribute to enrich the public sphere with more complex, articulated, not simplistic viewpoints, and that will add also opinion of migrants, of the people who are directly involved in migration. So we should try not to forget that even in the harshest situation, migrants have their own agency, their own capability to take decisions about what to tell and what not to tell. So their involvement also in the construction of legal frameworks and everything about migration should be welcome, I think. But of course, it cannot substitute that very important work of technicians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianluca. And I think it's very interesting how this panel is turning out that we're seeing quite different ways, I guess, of trying to capture the experience of this offence that we're interested in today. And it is, of course, something that we need to acknowledge that we have not on this panel, included somebody who has personally gone through these experiences. And I mean, we should discuss that in the sort of end. But obviously, there are ethical questions and there are also practical questions. But this is something which I think we, as those of us working on these issues, either from the academy or as lawyers or from organisations, it is something which we need to acknowledge and to be mindful of. So our last speaker on the panel will take another perspective entirely, and forgive me if I'm definitely doing Australian mispronunciation of your name. Calogero Ferrara is our final speaker. He is a European delegated prosecutor at the European Public Prosecutor's Office since May this year, so fairly recently. Before that, he worked as deputy prosecutor at the Office of the Prosecutor in Palermo on organised crime, smuggling and trafficking, terrorism, drug trafficking, financial and economic crimes, and environmental criminality. Calogero represented the state in cases before trial chambers and jurors' courts and worked as a trial attorney at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He has vast experience as a speaker in training courses and seminars for judges, prosecutors, jurists, and law enforcement officers in Italy and abroad. And he has been frequently appointed as a legal expert in projects concerning international cooperation and exchange of information between judicial authorities and law enforcement agencies. Today, he will be speaking to us on the struggle against trafficking of human beings, the Italian experience, and you have about 20 minutes. So I will now hand over to you.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, indeed, as you just said, I was recently appointed as a European prosecutor, so this is my first speaking in this new role, and of course I tended to highlight that I'm speaking on as my personal opinion and don't represent the Office of the Prosecutor, but in any case the Office of the European Prosecutor does not have jurisdiction on this specific crime because it's a different kind of Office of the Prosecutor, but I dealt with this crime for almost 10 years, 15 years in the past, because in the Italian experience, they are very linked to organized crime. I started sharing the screen, if I can. You can watch it.
And now I can see ourselves on the screen, which is very disturbing. So it was not your PowerPoint, but it was the actual screen.
Should arrive here.
Yes, that's working. Yeah.
Okay, so, and as you can see here, my short presentation is linked to what Professor Gatta just said about Lampedusa, and especially here you find one of the best beaches in Lampedusa, the so-called Island of Rabbit, or Isola dei Conigli, but I did not put this picture here to make you jealous to come here, even if you have time you should, because it's a beautiful place, but because as Professor Gatta said, here Lampedusa is one of the main location involved in the route of the smuggling and trafficking of human beings, especially in the so-called Central Mediterranean route between Central Africa, Libya or Tunisia, Lampedusa, Sicily, and so on toward other countries of the European continent. And especially because here in Lampedusa, on 3rd October 2013, happened one of the worst tragedy in time of peace, with the death of more than 366 people. Indeed, at the end there were 368, when it was a shipwreck just a few miles from the shore of this beautiful place. This also changed the judicial approach, the investigative approach, at least in my office, the Prosecutor Office of Palermo had the jurisdiction over Lampedusa, but also in other prosecutor office, because with the tragedy of Lampedusa was clear, and we are talking about in 2013, how the flow of migration, of the so-called emergency crisis, migration crisis, started in that period with the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people, especially in this corridor, the so-called Central Mediterranean route. That is was what was affecting at least the territory of my jurisdiction. But why, for the interpreter, for the investigator, for the prosecutor, for the judge, is so complex, is so complicated dealing with this criminal phenomenon? Because in this field, more than in others, we have a complexity and combination of different national, international sources that have to be balanced with human rights that can be involved at the victim of the crime, for the victim of crime, and also because we have registered an increasing role of organized crime, much more than in other sector, because there is a very particular
Calogero, scusa, faccio un intervento a gamba tesa in italiano, così riusciamo a comunicare più direttamente. Noi in questo momento vediamo probabilmente una slide sbagliata, può essere, stiamo vedendo forse una delle tue ultime slide. Ok, perfetto. Se potessi mettere lo slideshow, che lo trovi nella barra in basso accanto a commenti, diciamo, non so se lo vedi, accanto a commenti, sotto in basso, diciamo nella tua pagina, il tuo screen, c'è note, commenti, e poi accanto c'è il tasto slideshow.
La chiudo e la riapro, scusate. I'm sorry for this, but usually it doesn't work. The problem is this. You can see now.
It's the same as before. We're seeing your PowerPoint, but probably the right slide, but not in slideshow mode. Okay, now we are seeing ourselves. No, now we're seeing your screen. Okay.
I'm sharing my screen.
No, forse è meglio. Cioè, poc'anzi andava bene, dovevi soltanto mettere lo slideshow.
Ovviamente slideshow mettevo.
Va bene, però diciamo se non riesce ad andare avanti, cioè, così comunque riusciamo.
Ora che vedete? Vediamo
tutto il PowerPoint. Inclusa la slide principale che è la seconda, quindi se non riesci a metterlo in maniera diversa da così, va bene così, insomma, comunque ti seguiamo.
I'm sorry for that. I put a slideshow, of course, here.
I think it's all right. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
if we can see the one down the left-hand side. We'll just keep
sorry for that, but if you can see, it's okay. So the problem is, as you can see in this other slide, so you are watching the different slide like in PowerPoint, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, you've moved on.
Let's keep in this way. But the problem is, as I told you, that in this field there was an increasing role of organized crime, and first of all, from the point of view of the interpreter and especially of the prosecutor investigator, there was the main problem to an effective distinction between smuggling and trafficking, based on the fact that in the smuggling case, many times there is a consent of the victim of the crime that allow that contact the criminal group to allow the illegal trip between different countries, and this determines the consideration of this kind of victim not like a sort of a guilty victim that create his or her own fate. This was an approach that, of course, should not be particularly considered, should be rejected. But I have to tell you that from the practical experience, was not very easy, especially at the beginning, especially between a law enforcement agency, to a clear distinction between a guilty victim or a not guilty victim, because usually the victim of trafficking is a guilty victim. So there was like sort of different consideration of these two kind of case. Luckily, the different international legal source, and especially the UN legal framework, provided us guidelines in dealing with this criminal phenomenon, especially with the two additional protocols on fighting trafficking and smuggling of human beings that are attached to UN Convention on Transnational Crime of signing exactly in Palermo here in 2000. But also I think that, as I tried to explain at the end, that also in the statutes of a few international court or criminal international tribunals, is possible to find a consideration, to find the roots, the grounds to consider this kind of crime as a sort of a crime against humanity. As I told you, luckily the UN protocols gave us a clear guidelines, and also is important in the scope, between the scopes of the UN protocols, we find not only the main purpose to prevent and combat trafficking in person, smuggling in person, but also the goal, the aim to protect and assist the victim and to respect their human rights. But also on the other side, the protocols highlighted the importance to promote international cooperation, because also the legislator of 2003, even if they have in mind a very different kind of especially smuggling activity, because at the time we did not have the arrival of hundreds of thousands of people, of millions in some years, as we will see, for example, in 2015, 2016, all together, or thousands of them all together in a boat. But in any case, it was clear also at that time the importance to have an effective promotion of international judicial cooperation and police cooperation to effectively dealing with this kind of crimes. The important thing is that the protocols not only give us a comprehensive detailed definition for the first time of trafficking and smuggling and how to distinguish them. The main distinction is based on the purpose of exploitation that we find in trafficking, but we don't find in smuggling, but also introduce a duty for member states of the criminalization for the behavior identified in the protocols, and introduce many mechanisms for victims protection and for increasing this effectiveness of cooperation. This is in very general term, but from the practical point of view, that is also at the end the approach of the prosecutor, because of course we deal with practical case. As I told you, the turning point, a really cornerstone in our activity was the Lampedusa case. Why so important? And also I want to remember that in the now in Lampedusa, if you have time to stop by there, you also find a museum, the Museum of Memories, as Professor Gatta say, and especially there we were able to collect a few memories of the migrants that dying in these years nearby, like some pictures, mobile and so on. Is a very moving moment if you can visit there. So as I told you, why the Lampedusa case is so important, at least it was so important in our judicial experience, not only for the large number of deaths, of course, but because also we had a similar case in the past, not with such large number, but also very tragic case. But because usually in the past the main the investigation was very focused on the identification of the skipper of the skipper of the boat, of the captain of the boat. Usually he was tried, convicted, and a few years sent back to his country, where usually he started again his criminal activity. So there was no idea, no general idea to try to identify the criminal networks that were starting growing behind this activity. And what I told you is true, because also in the Lampedusa case, the skipper, the captain of the boat, was a Tunisian. He was also in that case immediately identified and arrested, and was identified as a person that also in the past has been arrested, was arrested here in Italy for the same criminal activity. In this case, we tried to do something else and something more, because in my office, we started thinking with the increasing in the next day of this arrival, and so we started thinking that we could have, could be just the peak of an iceberg for such criminal activity operated between Africa, or in the shore of Africa, towards Sicily, due to the geographical reason, of course. You know that Sicily is exactly in the middle of the Mediterranean. And so our idea was to try to apply the same rules, the same investigative tools, the same investigative approach that we had in the past against the most famous Sicilian mafia, that is Cosa Nostra. So that the idea to look at the different arrival, the different boat, as a part of unique criminal plan. To make this, of course, this was also possible because in our legislation, smuggling and trafficking of people are considered a typical organized crime case. So due to the Italian system, where we have, as explained here in this slide, the so-called double track system, we have different rules that we can apply when we investigate or prosecute organized crimes. Also in this case, we started using this very powerful tool, especially from the point of view of prosecutor, to try not only to identify the smuggler of a single case, but to try to identify the criminal network that for surely in our idea were operating behind this arrival. Criminal network operating not only in Africa, but because it was clear with the interview of the migrants, with the investigation of the skipper, with other investigative activity like wiretappings, like interception and so on, that we started in that period, that they have also link in Italy first and in other parts of Europe too, like especially in the country like UK, like France, like Germany or Scandinavia, that are usually the final destination of the trip of the migrants. We also try to focus on the financial profile, because hearing the conversation of the people that we were able to intercept, I have to remember you that the interceptions in Italy can be, I know that it's different in UK, but in Italy you can use interception directly as evidence in court. So you don't need, in very specific case, in very particular case, any kind of external corroboration, just the interception, the conversation between two people, can be used against them if, of course, there are not is a clear interpretation, there are and so on. So for doing this also, it was necessary from the subjective point of view, from the people who were investigating on this, was decided in my office to create a specialized group of prosecutors that could deal with this kind of criminal phenomenon, and also on the side of an investigator of the police, especially at the central level, because the idea was to try to collect the different information coming from different part of the Italian territory, or also from abroad, with the involvement of the central services of the police, that of course, where there is of course a gathering of this different kind of information. Of course, the follow-up of the investigation started exactly from the statement of the survivors, who started giving us information about their trip, about the people that they contacted, the telephone number that they have to all the social network profile, or the documents, and so on. And I have to tell you that at the beginning there was a great skepticism, especially by the judicial, by the police, and also by judicial authorities, because clearly you are talking about investigations that are very, very complicated. You are talking about investigations that are spread in an enormous part of the world, because most of the investigations started from analyzing the trip of migrants from Central Africa, or that part outside, of course, Italy and Europe, but also that involve also the final part in Northern Europe. So you can imagine what we are talking about. There was also the difficulty to dealing with people speaking languages that sometimes we do not have also interpreters that could understand them, and so on. But after that, and after the first difficulties, when you start completely new job, I have to tell you that we have also a good positive, many positive outcomes, especially with the use of the interceptions, as I told you, because interception in organized crime case, I have to tell you also from my experience dealing with mafia cases, by now, to really try to understand the internal structure of such criminal organization, they are in my opinion, an essential tools of investigation. You can read here, for example, in this slide, a direct interception between two of the main smugglers involved in the Lampedusa case, when they were commenting what happened, and then they give us to the other a clear instruction on how to deal with the migrants, also keeping in mind that the person responsible, the smuggler is the person responsible for the fate of what they are transporting, is exactly what they say in the Arabic original version, and this is based on the fact that these people consider the migrants as human goods that are very remunerative, as I told you, because they are not interested in their fate, because the migrants usually they pay in advance, and also so if they lose their life during the trip, once they have paid in advance, the only risk can be the damage of reputation of the smugglers. As I told you, and also as the Palermo protocol legislator has in mind, in my opinion, one of the main things in this kind of investigation is to try to strengthen the international cooperation, because we are talking about criminal groups that are operate not like a unique association, but they are like loose groups that are connected each other, operating in in very narrow connection each other, but in different parts of the world. So it is necessary to try to identify the representative, the member in the original country, like in Africa, in the transit country, like usually is Italy and Sicily in particular, because Sicily is clearly a very poor economy, so it's not considered the final destination of the trip of the migrants who are looking for a different kind of destination, when they can earn money, when they have relatives and so on, and also especially the destination country, where it's clear there is the final ramification, the final contact of this criminal group. In doing this, since the very beginning, my idea was to share, you know, usually the prosecutor are very jealous of their information collected during investigation, but my idea was that in this case, especially when you have so many countries involved, is a bit not as a nonsense, is a to keep your information on your table, because on your desk, because you need to share it with people that can use them in other part of the world. So our idea was to call coordination meeting at Eurojust, you know, the agency of European Union to promote judicial cooperation, and also to deliver the relevant data to Europol, to try to cross-check the different information coming from a different country, but also to involve directly the foreign judicial authority who could be interested in investigating this phenomenon, sharing with them the evidentiary material. And also a very interesting project that we were able to sign here, the office of, I'm not part of the prosecutor office in Palermo, but luckily the project is still ongoing. The project was signed under Article 19 of the EUMoSIT, the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime, between some European Union countries, the judicial authority of some European countries, but also of the International Criminal Court, but also of Europol, and also as external partner of some African countries. The idea was to share information in a much more quick speed and not a formal way, because investigation, as the criminals behave quickly, with the contrast to them need to be quick as well. Also, another very and also this project was recognized so important, that was also founded by European Union with like I think 3 or 4 million euros for 4 or 5 years. And also another interest project with the same aims, with same goals, was supported by UNODC with the placement of deployment of liaison, African liaison magistrate in some judicial offices in Italy, like for example in the Office of Prosecutor in Palermo, there was a Nigerian federal prosecutor office, because the idea was the possibility to have an African prosecutor in the room, the next room. Of course, you can imagine the importance of sharing information, of or asking information in a very different and less formal way, and especially information that was not going through the formal channel of communication, diplomatic channel, that can be slow, can be risky, because the information can be used by someone else for different reasons. At the end of this, all of this, we were able to lead a few investigations that, from my point of view, but of course I can be biased on this because I was the prosecutor, but I think that the final conviction on this, the final identification of criminal perpetrator on this, should be a guarantee for this outcome. The so-called operations Glauco, I think is from the name of the saint patron of the sailors, something like that. I don't know, it's the police usually who invented the name of this operation, but this had a particular success as a name. And as you can see in this slide, we were able to identify in a starting in 2013 and finish the last investigation was conducted in 2020, at the end of 2020, when I left now I left the office, but probably I imagine that there are others still ongoing. We were able to identify different criminal groups operating in different parts of the world. So we were able to accuse these people of a criminal conspiracy, criminal association of transnational nature, aimed at hiding and abetting illegal smuggling of people and trafficking of people, because according to the evidence that we collect, most of the smuggling case become trafficking case during the trip. One of the also particularly interesting thing, in my opinion, is also as I told you at the beginning, the financial profile, because we are talking about people that make the job, as usually the criminals do, of course, for financial purpose, to getting money, to earn money by the criminal activity. And it was particularly interesting at the beginning of the investigation that we hear these people always talking about the use of Avala method for the payment of the trip of the migrants from Sudan, from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Libya, and so on. So at the beginning we were very curious about that, because, as you know, probably Avala is a method of payment that was used since the Middle Age by Arabic tradesmen, and but is not forbidden in many countries. It's a legal method of payment in many countries, because it's a method based on trust. And indeed, Avala comes from the word abl, that is trust in Arabic. It is basically a mean of transfer money that after spread in other part of the world. This is an informal money transfer system, but from the criminal point of view, it's very interesting because it does not leave tracks. We were able to identify this kind of system used by the smugglers through the investigation, especially through the statement of the migrants who paid the trip in this way, or also through the interceptions when they used to call, send me money through Avala, send this money for Avala for using this code, and so on. But basically the fact is that the Avala method allow people, even people that are not have enough money to pay the trip, to buy the ticket, let's say, for the trip with the support of the relatives, maybe in London, maybe in Rome, or in other part of the world, that can go to an avaladar, so a small shop usually, where they pay the money for the trip of the relative. It can be a cousin, it can be a daughter, it can be a son, and so on. That is not directly sent to the smuggler. This is the important thing from their point of view. There is not a direct link, because usually the avaladar keep the money until when it reaches a certain amount, keeping a fee for him or herself. And after moving this amount of money with some investments or other kind of activity in an offshore country, or in a country where it's not easy to track this financial movement. At the beginning, it was not very clear what kind of crime we could accuse the people using this, but I have to tell you that when we started watching during one of the investigation and putting a video camera inside a small shop in Rome, we saw people bringing such large amount of money, like in 5 days, 6 days, we saw the arrival of such a large amount of money. We decided to intervene. We seized almost 800,000 euros in cash, plus dollars, plus pounds, $1,000, 1,000 pounds, and so on. At the end, we decided to accuse these people for a violation of a money laundering act and banking act here in Italy. And I have to tell you that after a few resistance by the judicial authorities, by the judges, the first two cases were not good, because the judge
Calogero, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm conscious we're not going to have any time for questions. So do you think would it be possible to?
Okay, I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Don't stop like that, but just because I'm sure people will have questions for you. But I was just hoping, do you want to draw a conclusion?
Is much better. The only last thing is that, as I told you, it is important that, in my opinion, that human trafficking requires a different approach that can be not only a national approach. This is the reason why, in my opinion, could be also an international perspective. And the grounds for this you can find, for example, in the Article 7 of the Rome statutes that set up the ICC, where we have a possible direct reference to the crime like deportation or forcible transfer of population or imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty. I think that in the case law of a few international criminal court, like for example in this case with the ICTY, this Monash et al., we can find the basis for this theory, for this legal theory. And also I have to tell you that, for example, the former ICC prosecutor in 2017 changed his approach to Libya. At the beginning was an approach based only on the investigation of a crime committed during the Gaddafi era, and now they are also investigating on the possible link with the human trafficking as part of a joint criminal enterprise for as a crime against humanity. I'm sorry for talking so much. Here you find my email if you're interested also in the future for future contact. Bye.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you. Do you think you could stop sharing your screen and then we could see people if they ask a question? Then I encourage people to turn their camera on. So thank you. They were three, pardon me, very different papers, and all taking, I think, quite distinctive approaches to how we understand this phenomenon that we're talking about today. So Alessandro, your hand is up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, but I didn't want to interrupt you if you were saying something.
Well, I suppose I'm trying to articulate what my question is, which is trying to understand how these three very different approaches to really investigating the issue work together, or whether everybody's having parallel conversations. That, you know, that on the one hand you have the sort of qualitative approach that Gianluca's describing, which is very familiar to me. I mean, it's the sort of kind of work I do with people in detention. On the other hand, you have the very kind of official producing of these important TIP reports that happen, you know, at regular intervals. And then you have what the prosecutors were doing and trying to kind of pull all different sources of information, but really for the purpose just of making the prosecution, not necessarily of building understanding, but of, you know, for an instrumental important purpose. And so I was wondering whether, for the three of you, do you see a kind of connection between these approaches, or are these all different tasks, and are you actually just engaging in quite different activities? Chervine, do you want to try and answer that?
Yeah, sure. I will try my best, but no, I think that there are some connection. It's also, I think, for the sake of this panel, that, for example, I focused on like the more quantitative data approach, but for example, we try also to put a lot of focus on more the qualitative that Gianluca mentioned through like the interviewing of victims, of other key stakeholders, NGOs, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, all the kind of partner that would be relevant, migrants themselves. I think what was very interesting in that presentation was the focus on like, I think Gianluca mentioned the selective approach of listening, basically, and it's true that maybe we do that too much, and maybe the law enforcement officers also do that too much in Nigeria. That's something that we realize in the way that police officers are interviewing the victims. Maybe they're not giving them enough space for them to actually share really fully their experience and enable us to get a grasp of it. At the moment, we're conducting some research, And maybe I will take that point and tell my consultants to take that into account. And then there are definitely some connection with what also Calogero Ferrara mentioned. He mentioned, for example, the UNODC initiative of the liaison magistrates, and indeed it is a very important initiative for us, and the role of like organized crime groups involvement in Sicily. Actually, some of these groups that have been prosecuted under the mafia legislation in Italy are Nigerian groups, and I think that we can see that kind of connection between what he has mentioned and what we perceive here in Nigeria, and the fact that we need to build some trust between the different countries, and that's the whole rationale actually behind the UNODC liaison magistrate initiative, because the cooperation with Nigeria was so low before that, that I think it improved it from also his own experience, from what I understood. And maybe I will let also others to say a few words.
Thank you. Gianluca, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think of course there is a connection in terms of tension. We have different degrees of structuring powers behind this approach to listening and collecting information and knowledge production. So of course, as individuals, we are more or less free depending on the position we are occupying. So my position is easier because the attempt is to create a space of listening without this selective approach. But at the same time, we have to learn from the selective listening, the language, the framework of concept and meanings, which affect the lives of people. I was thinking about the Eritrean and Ethiopian people rescued, let's say, just from their smugglers, but at the same time, those people have some instances in terms of economic, political desire, and so how they articulate their voice once they've been saved somehow from the perpetrators of violence. What about their need to be outside of their country, and so how they name that situation? Because for many migrants, the smuggler is an ambivalent person. It's not only a criminal grasping money from them, but is ambivalent. He's a criminal and is a friend. And these two figures are very difficult to understand from the point of view of law enforcement, but I think this tension among our approaches is very fruitful. Thanks.
Thank you. And Calogero?
Of course, as Gianluca and Chervine said, of course, the approach is different according to what kind of experience you are sharing. Of course, the approach of the prosecutor, of the police, is clearly different. But because you need information for your prosecution to build up your case, and you have also limited time and limited energy to spend on this. I remember, for example, that we have the arrival of 500 or 600 people. Now the modus operandi is a bit changed, but in 2016 or 14, remember that in Lampedusa arrived altogether 600, 700 people. So you can imagine to interview all of them, to make questionnaires to all of them, selected. Sometimes it's not also easy in different language and so on. So it's clear you tend to do a selection because you have a different purpose as a police, as a prosecutor. But on the other side, I think it's also important that, at least not only because I'm prosecutor, but in this case, at the end, we have also a judicial decision. So we don't have now only academic conference or political speech about the fact that exists this criminal group. Now we have judicial decision, final judicial decision with the Supreme Court in Italy and other countries, saying that in this part of the world are operating criminal groups that are operating in this way, using torture, using raping, using killing, using this kind of methods to get their criminal purpose. I think that is of course, it's important, the research and so on, but also it's important that we are not talking about some big, because in 10 years, in 15 years, sometimes you have people say, yes, but they are inventing all what these people were going, what they want to leave Africa and come to Europe because it's true. We have heard this in the political speech and so on. Now we have at least a few cases, not many, but we have many. We have a few. We have a decision saying that this is happening. This is, a knowledge, and is, let's say, I think is important also.
Thank you. So, Alessandro, there's time for your question.
Yeah, just a quick question for Chervine. I'm referring to one of your slides, of the slides that you shared. I took a picture to the slides, so I hope it's not a problem, in which you've shown that during the last 10 years approximately, there have been an increase in the average rates of convictions regarding human trafficking. Well, my question is a very criminological question, in that I was wondering whether this increase in convictions, according to your point of view, corresponds to an increase in the human trafficking, in fact, or it is due to other reasons which might have to do with law enforcement methods or policies and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, I will try to answer. I think that very quickly, I think that if it's an increase of human trafficking, it's difficult to say. But I think that the fact that we have the same tendency shows that we have more victims detected. So more victims detected may say that we have more human trafficking, but it may also say that we actually have improved our capacity to detect human trafficking. Maybe we had a lot of trafficking cases also before, but that were very not detected because for example, in Africa, it's shown that in recent times it did not really improve, but before it did. In some countries, the capacity to detect human trafficking have improved quite significantly. So maybe it's more like it goes together. We are more able to detect trafficking cases, and so we have more conviction happening. But I also think, especially when we look at what's happening in the Middle East, that there has also been quite some improvements in how to tackle human trafficking. In some countries, we're still struggling in the criminal justice response. I see some prosecutors still struggling to build a trafficking case, and they rather go with some other offense. So, for example, rape or some other related offenses, and not the tip offense, which is maybe too challenging for them to go with. But in some countries, it seems that they have now the knowledge, the expertise to actually prosecute this kind of cases. So I'm not sure it says that there is more trafficking, but I think it's more that we are better in identifying the trafficking cases. I hope that answers the question, but that's also very personal point of view.
Thank you. So there is one more question. We have a few more minutes. So Lorenzo, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is really for Mr. Ferrara. So you mentioned the Glauco investigation, but of course the Glauco investigation is also an investigation under which Medanie Bere famously was a victim of mistaken identity, was kept in prison for 3 years. And the Guardian reporter who exposed this case was famously wiretapped and put under police surveillance by you. And it is not the only case of mistaken identity or innocent person in prison. You will remember that in 2015, you went on live television to claim that you had dismantled the ISIS cell of Sicily, when in fact, as the court of Palermo later established, you had arrested a random Libyan refugee that was victim of a shipwreck and who had been accused of being a terrorist by a Moroccan drug dealer who had gotten a residence permit in exchange, which is the kind of anti-mafia method that you referred to, giving something in exchange for collaboration. That in the case of the migration crisis has led to several mistakes, several unjust prosecutions, such the ones I mentioned. And the list